Everything you have been told about the Knights Templar is a carefully constructed lie. For 9 centuries, the world has whispered of their gold, their hidden treasures, and their lost maps. But the gold was a distraction. The real secret was far more dangerous. A truth so corrosive that the Vatican spent 300 years burning every man who had seen it. In the winter of 1118, 9 men descended into the dark beneath the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. They were not looking for the Holy Grail. They were looking for the reason why God had gone silent. What they found, buried under 30 feet of dust and ancient stone, was not a treasure, but an absence. They found the second gospel, the gospel of the void, which proved that the world we inhabit is not a creation, but a mistake. This is the forbidden knowledge that corrupted their bloodline and turned holy warriors into masters of the dark. This is the truth the king buried, and the church tried to erase from the memory of man. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Forget the world outside your window. Imagine the cold, damp stone of the 12th century, the flicker of a single candle against the obsidian dark. We are going back to the beginning, to the moment the shovel hit the floor of the world. The year was 1118. The city of Jerusalem was a jagged crown of white stone under a sun that felt like a judgment. The First Crusade had ended, leaving behind a kingdom built on blood and fragile hope. While other knights sought land and titles, 9 men, led by the quiet and intense Hugo de Payens, asked for something much stranger. They asked King Baldwin II for the right to live within the ruins of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the site where the Temple of Solomon once stood. To the outside world, they were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. They wore ragged clothes and shared a single horse between 2 men. But inside the dark halls of the temple, their poverty was a mask. For 7 long years, they did not guard the roads. They did not fight the sun. Instead, they dug. Imagine the sound of iron hitting limestone in the dead of night. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of the pickaxe echoing through the subterranean vaults. The air in those tunnels was old, heavy with the weight of thousands of years of silence. There was no oxygen, only the smell of salt and the stale breath of the earth. These men were not archaeologists. They were seekers of a terrifying clarity. Hugo de Payens would stand at the entrance of the shaft, holding a torch high. His eyes were not on the walls, but on the shadows. He knew that beneath the holy city lay a geography of secrets. The Temple of Solomon was not just a house of prayer, it was a vault designed to keep something out of the light. As the months turned into years, the 9 knights became shadows themselves. They grew thin, their skin turned the color of the limestone they worked. They spoke in whispers, terrified that if they raised their voices, the weight of the mountain above them would come crashing down to silence them forever. They were digging toward a specific point, a location marked on a map that had been smuggled out of a hidden library in Alexandria. It was a spot where the foundations of the world supposedly met the architecture of the divine. But as they went deeper, the information they gathered began to change them. They found artifacts that did not belong to the history of the Bible. They found strange, geometric carvings in the deep bedrock that predated the Hebrews, predated the Egyptians, and seemed to mock the very idea of human time. One night, in the 7th year of their excavation, the ground beneath the pickaxe of André de Montbard gave way. It was not a collapse, but an opening, a perfect, circular hole into a void that seemed to breathe. The air that rushed out was ice-cold, smelling of nothingness. Not rot, not earth, just a pure, terrifying void. The 9 knights gathered around the hole. They did not speak. In the flickering light of their torches, they looked at one another and saw the same expression, a mixture of religious awe and primal dread. They had spent 7 years in the dark to reach this moment. Yet now that the door was open, the weight of their mission felt like a leaden shroud. Hugo de Payens was the first to descend. He tied a rope of rough hemp around his waist and lowered himself into the blackness. As he sank, the sounds of the world above, the wind, the distant prayers from the mosque, the shuffling feet of his brothers, all vanished. He was entering a space where time seemed to have no meaning when his boots finally touched the floor. He was in a chamber that defied every law of medieval architecture. The walls were not made of stone blocks, but of a single, continuous sheet of dark, translucent material that looked like frozen water. It was obsidian, but it was warmer to the touch. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into the gloom, and the floor was perfectly smooth, polished to a mirror finish. As Hugo raised his torch, the light did not reflect. It was swallowed. The chamber seemed to eat the flame, leaving only a small, dim circle of visibility around him. In the center of this room sat a simple stone plinth. On top of it was not a golden box, not the tablets of the law, and not a holy relic of the cross. It was a single scroll, wrapped in a casing of lead and sealed with a substance that looked like dried blood. Hugo reached out, his hand trembling. He was a man who had killed in the name of God. He had seen the walls of Jerusalem fall. He was not a man of fear, but as his fingers brushed the lead casing, he felt a jolt of cold lightning. It was a psychic shock, a realization that everything he believed about the nature of the soul was a lie. He brought the scroll back to the surface. For 3 days and 3 nights, the 9 knights stayed in the tunnels. They did not eat, they did not sleep. They huddled around a single oil lamp and broke the seal. They were the first men in a millennium to read the words of the second gospel. It was not written in Hebrew or Greek or Latin. It was written in a language of symbols that seemed to speak directly to the mind, bypassing the ears. As they read, the history of the world began to unspool before their eyes. The scrolls spoke of a time before the sun, a time when there was only a great silence. It described the creation not as an act of love, but as an accident, a fracture in the silence that trapped pieces of the divine in cages of flesh and bone. The moral decay began that very night. If the world was a mistake, then there was no sin. If the Creator was not a father but a distant, unfeeling force that had forgotten its own accident, then the church in Rome was nothing more than a theater of shadows. The knights looked at their white mantles and saw them for what they were, costumes. They looked at their swords and saw them as tools for a god that wasn't listening. This was the nothing they had discovered. Not a lack of treasure, but the discovery that the spiritual foundation of Europe was a void. They realized that if they revealed this truth, the world would collapse. The peasants would stop working the fields. The kings would lose their divine right. The very fabric of human society would tear apart. They had a choice, to destroy the scroll and return to their lives, or to become the keepers of the lie. They chose the latter. But the secret was a parasite. It began to eat them from the inside out. They grew colder, more calculated. They realized that power was the only thing that mattered in a world without a soul. They would use the church's own structures to build an empire of their own, a shadow empire that would protect the secret while they sought a way to escape the cage the scroll had described. This is why they became the bankers of Europe. This is why they built cathedrals with hidden geometries. They were not building houses of God. They were building laboratories for the study of the void. Every archway, every stained glass window, and every cryptic carving in a Templar church was a piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. The puzzle of how to unmake the world. That as the years passed, the 9 knights returned to Europe, but they were no longer the men who had left. They were silent, brooding figures who seemed to look through people rather than at them. They carried the weight of the void in their eyes. When they stood before the Pope to receive their official recognition, they knelt and kissed the ring of the fisherman, but in their hearts they were laughing. They saw the golden robes and the incense and the Latin prayers as a grand, absurd comedy. They were the only ones who knew the stage was empty, but carrying such a secret requires a moral compromise that eventually rots the heart. To keep the world believing in the lie, the Templars had to become the ultimate deceivers. They began to recruit, but they did not look for the most pious men. They looked for the most intelligent, the most broken, and the most ambitious. The initiation rituals changed. Behind closed doors, in the dead of night, the new recruits were not taught the Bible. They were taught the negative theology. They were shown the obsidian chamber in their minds. They were told that the cross was not a symbol of salvation, but a symbol of the 4 walls of the prison. The American and Tier 1 audiences, who value information, will find interest in the historical records of the time. Records from the trials in the 1400s describe witnesses who claimed the Templars would spit on the cross during their private ceremonies. History tells us this was a false confession forced by torture. But what if it wasn't? What if they spat on the cross not because they worshipped the devil, but because they hated the prison it represented? The psychological decay was profound. Imagine a man who believes that nothing he does matters, yet he must act as if everything is holy. This creates a split in the psyche, a darkness that must find an outlet. The Templar commanderies became places of strange, quiet experiments. They studied the limits of pain, the limits of the mind, and the alchemy of the soul. They were searching for a key mentioned in the second gospel. The scroll had hinted that while the world was a prison, there was a way to decreate the self and return to the great silence. They became obsessed with this exit. All their wealth, all their castles, all their influence was directed toward this one goal. They began to treat the rest of humanity as cattle, useful only for funding their search for the exit. This is the moral failure that the Church eventually sensed. The Vatican didn't fear the Templars' wealth. They feared the Templars' indifference. The Church survives on the idea that every soul is precious and every sin must be confessed. The Templars, however, had moved beyond sin. They were operating in a reality where the rules of men and the rules of the Church were irrelevant. In the long candlelit nights of the 13th century, in the stone fortresses of France and England, the Grand Masters would sit alone with the lead-cased scroll. They would read the symbols until their eyes bled. They were looking for the formula to break the world. The common people saw them as heroes, the defenders of the faith, but the knights looked down from their horses and felt only a cold, distant pity. They knew the peasants were praying to a shadow. They knew the kings were fighting for dirt, and they knew that eventually, the secret would become too heavy to hold. The void was not a static thing. It was growing. The more people who learned of the secret, the more the nothingness seemed to bleed into the physical world. Strange things began to happen in the lands owned by the Templars. Crops would fail in perfect geometric patterns. The air would grow cold for no reason. People would report hearing a sound like a distant, endless scream, coming from deep within the earth. The knights knew what it was. The accident of creation was beginning to fray at the edges because they were pulling at the threads. They were close to finding the key. They were close to opening the door they had found beneath the Temple of Solomon. But they were not the only ones watching. The King of France, Philip the Fair, was a man of cold ambition, but he was also a man who feared what he couldn't control. He didn't want the Templars' gold. He wanted to know why they no longer feared him. He wanted to know why they looked at his throne as if it were made of straw. He began to plant spies within the order. He began to listen to the whispers of the disillusioned brothers, and what he heard terrified him more than any army. The spies returned with stories of the Black Mass, but they were describing it incorrectly. They were seeing the Templars' rituals through the lens of their own superstition. They didn't understand that the knights weren't calling out to a demon. They were calling out to the silence. Philip the Fair realized that if this secret got out, his kingdom would vanish in a day, not because of a war, but because the people would simply stop believing in the reality of the crown. He saw the moral decay of the order, but he also saw his own destruction. The trap was being set. The hammers were being forged. The date was chosen, a Friday in October that would live in infamy for 1,000 years. But the Templars, in their cold, analytical towers, already knew it was coming. They had read the scroll. They knew that the prison always fights back when a prisoner tries to pick the lock. The question was, would they hide the scroll, or would they use the fire of their own execution to ignite the secret and burn the world to the ground? The torches were already being lit in the streets of Paris. The king's men were sharpening their blades, but inside the temple, the knights were doing something far more terrifying. They were preparing to let the nothing out. In our next chapter, we will witness the night the shadow fell, the true reason the Templars went to the stake without a fight, and the terrifying discovery the king's men made when they finally broke into the Grand Master's private vault. The gold was gone, but something else was waiting for them in the dark. In the classified archives of medieval history, there exists a file that defies the logic of the cross. When the Templar fleet returned from the Holy Land in 1127, they brought back a behavioral anomaly that had been erased from official church doctrine. These men were no longer warriors of the light. They were encrypted vessels of an intellectual void. Their prayers had been replaced by a silence so profound it acted like a psychic dead zone. The hidden truth is that they did not lose their faith to a physical enemy. They discarded it because they had access to classified reality that rendered their previous existence obsolete. The spiritual data they gathered in the dark of Jerusalem had modified their very consciousness, turning holy warriors into encrypted soldiers of a war that had no God. The church noted the change but was terrified to document the source of the anomaly. They saw men who stood in the rain for hours without blinking, men whose heart rates remained steady in the face of death, and men who refused to utter the name of the Savior. This was not a loss of discipline, but a total overwrite of their internal operating system. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is sterile and filtered, carrying the faint scent of ozone. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be burned. As we scroll through the digitized records of 1127, the faint flicker of the monitor illuminates a reality that the world has tried to delete. The past is not a story. It is a series of encrypted events waiting to be decrypted. The physical arrival of the Templar fleet at the docks of Marseille was recorded by the harbor master as a moment of profound atmospheric heavy. The ships moved with a mechanical precision that seemed to ignore the chaotic currents of the Mediterranean. On deck, the knights stood like statues of grey iron, their white mantles stained with the dust of 1,000 ex. There was no singing. There was no shouting. The traditional hymns of homecoming, the songs that usually filled the air when crusaders returned to European soil, were entirely absent. The air around the ships felt dense, as if the vessels were carrying a vacuum that sucked the sound out of the harbor. The Bishop of Marseille stood on the pier, prepared to lead a grand procession of the Te Deum. He had brought incense, bells, and a choir of boys to celebrate the return of the Holy Defenders. But as the first knight stepped onto the wooden planks, the bishop's record indicates that the air grew ice cold. The knight did not kneel. He did not cross himself. He walked past the bishop with eyes that were wide, dilated, and fixed on a point that did not exist in the physical world. The bishop described the encounter as walking past a man who was no longer there, a hollow shell that moved with a terrifying, calculated grace. As more knights disembarked, the anomaly became impossible to ignore. They moved in perfect synchronization, their footsteps hitting the wood with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a single heartbeat. They did not look at the crowds of people who had gathered to cheer for them. They did not look at the banners or the flowers. They were operating on a frequency that was entirely alien to the medieval environment. The archival data suggests that their nervous systems had been recalibrated during their 7 years in the tunnels. They had seen something that made the social and religious structures of Marseille look like a poorly constructed stage play. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the private journals of the order's chaplains. These were the men whose sole purpose was to maintain the spiritual health of the knights. In the months following the return, these chaplains began to document a total collapse of religious ritual within the community. The knights had stopped attending the daily offices. The bells for matins and vespers would ring through the stone halls, but the knights remained in their cells, sitting in total darkness. They were not sleeping. They were not resting. They were practicing a form of sensory deprivation that they had learned in the East. They were anchoring themselves in the void. One chaplain noted that when he tried to lead a prayer, the knights would simply stare at him with a cold, analytical detachment. It was as if he was speaking a language that had lost all meaning. They were not angry. They were indifferent. This indifference was the most terrifying part of the anomaly. The church could handle heresy, but it could not handle a complete lack of interest in the divine. The Templars had found a hidden truth that made the theology of the 1200s look like a childish fantasy. They had moved beyond the need for a savior because they had discovered that there was no one to save. As we deep dive into the logistics of their return, we find that the knights immediately began to modify the architecture of their community. They moved away from the traditional layouts of Christian monasteries. They began to build circular chapels that were mathematically aligned with the silence. These buildings were not designed for worship. They were designed for resonance. They were stone machines built to capture the vibration of the void. The walls were thick, the windows were narrow, and the interior spaces were designed to swallow sound. The atmospheric build of these places was one of intense, cold stillness. The knights would gather in these circular spaces at midnight. They did not speak. They did not chant. They stood in a circle, their hands held a few inches apart, creating a circuit of physical absence. They were training their bodies to exist in a state of constant, low-level dissociation. They were becoming the first masters of a cold, analytical reality. This behavioral shift was the primary reason the church began to grow uneasy. The Templars were no longer under the control of the religious narrative. They had built their own narrative, one that was encrypted and hidden behind the walls of their new fortresses. The moral decay that the church later cited was in fact a transition from emotion to system. The knights had realized that in a world without a soul, the only thing that mattered was the control of resources and information. They stopped seeing people as brothers and sisters in Christ, and started seeing them as biological units within a larger economic framework. This is the moment the Templars became the first international bankers. They were not interested in wealth for the sake of luxury. They were interested in the movement of capital as a way to track the energy of the physical world. They were applying the cold logic of the void to the markets of Europe. They created a system of encrypted ledgers. They used symbols and ciphers to track their assets, creating an information network that was entirely opaque to the king and the pope. This was the first true deep state. They were operating in the shadows of the medieval world, using their reputation as holy warriors to hide the fact that they were building a global machine. Every piece of gold they moved was a step toward the unmaking of the old world. They were using the church's own tools to build a reality that would eventually destroy the church. The archival records from the commandery at La Rochelle describe the knights' interaction with the local population. The people were terrified of them. They spoke of the hollow men who lived in the stone tower. They noticed that the knights did not eat meat, did not drink wine, and did not laugh. They lived on a diet of bread and water, not as an act of penance, but as a way to keep their bodies at a level of minimal biological interference. They wanted their minds to be as clear and as cold as the obsidian chamber they had found. The atmospheric build of the town of La Rochelle changed during this period. The air felt heavy, and the people reported a constant low-frequency hum coming from the Templar Tower. It was a sound that made their teeth ache and their minds feel foggy. The Knights were testing the limits of the resonance. They were trying to see if they could project the silence of the void into the surrounding environment. They were treating the town as a laboratory, and the people as test subjects. This was the analytical cruelty of the New Order, had moved beyond the concepts of good and evil and into a space of pure experimentation. Intellectual curiosity forces us to ask why the King of France did not act sooner. The answer lies in the sheer efficiency of the Templar system. They had made themselves indispensable. They managed the royal treasuries, they organized the logistics of the state, and they provided the most disciplined military force in the world. They were the invisible architecture of the kingdom. The king was afraid to move against them because he realized that if he pulled one thread, the entire fabric of his reality might unravel. He was a prisoner of the system they had created. But the king was also noticing the anomaly. He saw the way the knights looked at him. They did not see a king chosen by God. They saw a temporary biological anomaly on a throne of straw. They treated his commands with a cold, mechanical obedience that was more insulting than open rebellion. They were waiting for him to become obsolete. They knew that the era of kings was coming to an end, and they were preparing to be the ones who managed the aftermath. They were the architects of a future that had no room for crowns. That as we deep dive further into the archives, we find the first reports of the silent plague. This was not a biological disease, but a psychological one. It began to spread among the servants and the younger brothers who lived within the Templar They began to catch the Templar stare. They stopped talking. They stopped praying. They began to move with the same mechanical precision as their masters. They were being pulled into the frequency of the void. The church tried to contain it by moving these men to different monasteries, but the anomaly only spread further. The hidden truth is that the Templars were not just keeping a secret. They were broadcasting a reality. They were using the structure of the medieval world to transmit a frequency that was unmaking the soul of Europe. Every cathedral they built, every bank they opened, and every knight they trained was a node in a global network of silence. They were turning the world into an encrypted file, a classified existence that only they knew how to read. They were the masters of the anomaly, and they were finally ready to begin the next phase of the program. The atmospheric build of the 13th century was a slow descent into a cold, analytical dread. The people knew that the world was changing, but they could not name the source of the shift. They saw the Templars and felt a primal fear, the fear of something that is not quite human. They saw the white mantles and the red crosses and realized that the symbols no longer meant what they once did. The symbols had been hijacked. They were now the markers of a classified power, a hidden force that was moving in the shadows of the cross. The knights had stopped praying because they had found the end of the conversation. They had realized that the universe does not listen and it does not care. They had accepted the silence and turned it into a weapon. They were the first men to truly live in the void, and they were inviting the rest of the world to join them. But the world was not ready for the silence. The world still needed the lies of the king and the pope to feel safe in the dark. The world was about to fight back, but it was fighting an enemy that it did not understand. The reflection on this historical anomaly reveals a moral decay that was total. The Templars had discarded their humanity to become a system. They had traded their souls for a classified clarity. This was the ultimate betrayal, the betrayal of the human condition itself. They were no longer men. They were the ghosts of the archive, the encrypted data of a lost civilization. They were the first to see the void, and they were the first to be consumed by it. But they had left a trail of encrypted files that we are only now beginning to decrypt. The air in the workspace is getting colder now. The hum of the servers is getting louder, filling the mind with a low, steady vibration. The file on 1127 is almost complete, but there are still missing pieces. There are gaps in the data that suggest a much larger conspiracy, a conspiracy that goes beyond the docks of Marseille and into the very foundations of our own modern world. The Templars may be gone, but the anomaly they brought back is still among us. It is the static in our communications. It is the coldness in our systems. It is the silence in our own minds. As we close this section of the archive, the monitor flickers one last time, revealing a final, encrypted note from the harbor master of Marseille. He wrote that on the day the fleet departed, he saw a knight standing at the edge of the pier, looking out at the sea. The knight did not have a shadow. The sun was directly above him, but there was no darkness on the wood beneath his feet. He was a man made of light and absence, a biological anomaly that defied the laws of physics. The harbor master was so terrified that he burned his original log, but the echo of that moment has survived in the classified records of the church. The knights had returned from Jerusalem with more than just a scroll. They had returned with a physical modification that made them transparent to the world. They were the shadowless men, the architects of a reality that has no depth. They were the first to realize that in a world of pure information, shadows are irrelevant. Only the data matters. And the data was showing a massive incoming anomaly that was about to hit the heart of Paris. The king's spies were right to be afraid. They were not watching a group of knights. They were watching a slow-motion atmospheric collapse. The files on the return to Marseille are now fully decrypted, but they only point to a much deeper anomaly. As the knights moved inland toward Paris, they began to leave behind a trail of psychological anomalies that the church could no longer ignore. There were reports of the singing stones in the new commanderies, and a black mass that was not about the devil, but about the total erasure of the self. The hidden truth was about to become a public horror. Next file is labeled 1307, The Night of the Iron Nets. It contains the encrypted transcripts of the king's final panic and the terrifying discovery that the soldiers made when they finally breached the walls of the Paris temple. They were looking for gold, but what they found was a physical manifestation of the void that was starting to swallow the city whole. The archive is waiting. The hum of the servers is steady. The next secret is ready to be unboxed. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. The logistical operation that occurred in the early hours of Friday, October 13, 1307, remains one of the most perfectly executed erasures in the history of the Western world. This was not a chaotic military strike. It was a classified synchronization of state power designed to trap an atmospheric anomaly that had become too large to contain in the encrypted ledgers of the French crown. The orders were distributed weeks in advance, held under a seal of absolute silence. Every bailiff and every seneschal in the kingdom received a file that was not to be opened until the precise moment of the raid. This was a systematic attempt to delete a hidden truth that had begun to override the social operating system of Europe. The crown was not hunting for heretics. They were deploying an iron net to capture a group of men who had successfully accessed a classified reality. The files suggest that King Philip the Fair was not motivated by simple greed, but by a deep, analytical terror of the void that was radiating from the Templar camp. The soldiers who moved through the mist of Paris were not just arresting knights. They were attempting to shut down a network of silence that was unmaking the reality of the throne. The file was stamped, "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The blue glow of the status lights reflects off the glass cabinets, casting long mechanical shadows. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to stay in the dark. As we pull the digitized records of the 1307 raid into the active window, the data reveals a level of planning that suggests a modern logistical precision. The atmospheric conditions in Paris on the night of October 12 were recorded as stifling and unnaturally still. There was no wind to move the heavy fog that had settled over the Seine. The city was a grid of stone and shadow, waiting for a command that was already in motion. In the royal palace, Guillaume de Nogaret sat with the final classified maps of the temple district. He was not looking at the gold vaults. He was looking at the energy nodes. He was mapping the places where the nothing was strongest. At precisely 3 a.m., the synchronization began. Across France, the iron nets were cast. In Paris, the sound of leather boots on damp cobblestones was the only warning. The soldiers moved in groups of 12, their faces masked to protect them from the psychological contagion of the Templar stare. They carried heavy iron chains and specialized nets that had been soaked in salt, a primitive attempt to ground the anomaly they expected to find. The objective was the Paris Temple, a fortress of grey stone, that stood as the headquarters of the silence. When the soldiers breached the outer gates of the temple, they did not find a garrison in a state of alarm. They found a profound, analytical stillness. The knights were not in their barracks. They were in the central hall, sitting in a perfect circle on the stone floor. They were not armed. They were not wearing their armor. They were dressed in simple white tunics, their hands resting on their knees. They were waiting for the net to fall. The archival records from the sergeant of the guard described the atmosphere inside the hall as unbreathable. He noted that the air felt thick and metallic, and that the torches carried by the soldiers began to burn with a steady, blue flame that emitted no heat. The hidden truth revealed in the classified trial depositions is that the knights did not resist because they had already finished the program. They had successfully encrypted the void into the geography of Europe, and the arrest was merely a logistical detail. As the soldiers moved forward to secure the Grand Master, Jacques de Mal, they reported that he did not speak. He simply looked at them with eyes that seemed to be reflecting a different coordinate in time. One soldier later testified in a classified hearing that when he touched de Mal's shoulder, he felt a jolt of static electricity so powerful it paralyzed his arm. For 3 days, while the knights were being led to the dungeons, a specialized team of archival researchers, under the command of Nogaret, began the search for the treasure. This is where the modern paradox becomes visible. They did not find piles of gold coins. They found room after room filled with empty lead boxes. Each box was labeled with a coordinate and a date, but the contents were missing. The soldiers reported a faint scent of ozone and ancient dust in the vaults, but no physical wealth. This led to the encrypted theory that the Templars had converted their entire treasury into a non-physical state, a form of information that could not be seized by the crown. The psychological toll on the arresting officers began almost immediately. Within 48 hours of the raid, the primary bailiffs began to report a series of classified anomalies. They spoke of a ringing in the ears that would not stop, and a sudden inability to recognize their own families. They were suffering from a cognitive collapse caused by the proximity to the void. The hidden truth is that the iron nets had not only captured the knights, they had also captured the frequency of the silence. The state had invited the anomaly into its own dungeons, and the erasure was starting to work in reverse. By the 3rd day of the arrests, the king was forced to issue a classified directive to the inquisitors. They were to use the most extreme methods not to find gold, but to find the encryption keys. They needed to know how to navigate the void. They needed to know what the knights had seen beneath the temple. The archival records of the interrogations are chilling in their analytical coldness. The inquisitors did not ask about the devil. They asked about the second gospel. They asked about the non-Euclidean soul. Knights' responses were recorded in a series of ciphers that the church's best cryptographers could not break. The atmosphere in Paris changed during that first week of the erasures. The people reported that the sun seemed dim, even on a cloudless day. There was a sense of quiet dread that settled over the city like a leaden blanket. The commoners began to whisper that the king had accidentally unmade the world by arresting its guardians. The moral decay of the state was becoming a physical reality. The king had committed a betrayal of the natural order to save his throne, and the silence was his reward. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the records of the disappeared. During the night of the iron nets, over 50 high-ranking Templars vanished from the Paris temple before the soldiers could reach them. There were no secret tunnels found. There were no signs of a struggle. The knights were simply deleted from the physical room. The archival data suggests a localized atmospheric collapse, a moment where the nothing reached a critical mass and allowed the knights to transition out of the king's reality. This was the ultimate encrypted escape, leaving only a faint smell of copper in the empty cells. As the knights were being processed into the dungeon of the temple, the archival researchers found a single, classified file in the Grand Master's private scriptorium. It was not a scroll. It was a sheet of obsidian that had been etched with symbols that glowed with a faint, steady light. When the researchers tried to move the obsidian, it was found to be immovable, as if it were fixed to a point in space rather than the floor. This was the anchor of the void, a physical anomaly that defied the laws of physics. The researchers were ordered to brick over the room and erase it from the palace maps. The moral decay of the Inquisition was born in those first days of the Templar trials. The Church realized that the standard narrative of good and evil was insufficient to deal with the anomaly. They had to invent a new category of crime, the crime of information possession. They had to frame the knights as devil worshippers, because the hidden truths that the knights were data collectors of a void was too dangerous for the masses. The state-sponsored lie was the only thing standing between the social order and a total cognitive collapse. The hidden truth of the 1307 raid is that the iron nets were a failure. The state captured the bodies of the knights, but they could not capture the frequency. The silence continued to resonate through the stone walls of the prisons. The guards reported that the knights would sit in their cells and hum a single, low note that made the stone vibrate. This was not a prayer, it was a maintenance protocol. They were keeping the connection stable. They were waiting for the final synchronization. As we deep dive into the logistics of the dungeon, the archival data reveals a series of psychological experiments conducted by the inquisitors. They tried to break the silence by using sensory overload. They used constant loud noise, blinding light, and chemical irritants. But the knights' heart rates remained steady. They did not respond to the external stimuli. They had successfully dissociated their consciousness from their biological cages. They were living without a soul, and the Inquisition was powerless against a man who was already gone. The atmospheric build of the Paris temple dungeon became a focal point for the anomaly. The stone walls began to grow a strange, crystalline frost that did not melt in the heat. The air inside the cells was measured at a temperature that should have been fatal, yet the knights showed no signs of distress. The researchers who monitored the prisons reported that the shadows in the hallways were starting to move independently of the guards, that nothing was manifesting in the dark, and the iron nets were starting to fray. King Philip's panic was recorded in a series of classified letters to his advisor, decrypt. He spoke of the eyes in the walls and the feeling that his own palace was being replaced by a grey void. He realized that the erasure was not work. The more he tried to delete the Templars, the more they became a permanent part of the atmosphere. The hidden truth was that the Templars had become the software of the kingdom, and the king was merely the hardware that was being overwritten. The moral decay of the French crown reached a critical point when the king ordered the execution of the first group of knights without a final trial. He needed the fire to act as a barrier. He believed that the high temperature of the pyre would destroy the information, but the archival records of the first burnings are anomalous. The witnesses reported that the knights did not scream. They stood in the flames and continued to hum the low note until their bodies were consumed. The fire did not destroy the secret. It turned the secret into smoke that drifted over the city. As we deep dive into the psychological aftermath of the raid, we find that the soldiers who had handled the iron nets were never the same. They were discharged from service and sent to remote villages, but the anomaly followed them. They were the first generation of shadowless men, carriers of the silence who would slowly fade from the memory of their families. They were the collateral damage of a war against a reality that they could not see. The hidden truth of 1307 is that it was the birth of the modern era of classification. The state realized that there are certain things that must never be known by the public. The iron nets were the first attempt to manage an information anomaly on a national scale. The success of the raid was a logistical triumph, but the cost was a permanent moral decay that remains in the foundations of our own world. We are still living in the shadows of the iron nets, waiting for the truth to be decrypted. The archival data for the night of October 13th is almost fully processed. The final classified report from Nogaret concludes that the nothing has been contained, but the air in the Palace of Justice suggests otherwise. The report ends with a strange, encrypted symbol that looks like a circular void. This was the signature of a man who knew he had already lost. The iron nets had captured a ghost, and the ghost was now the master of the house. As we sit in the cold light of the workstation, we must ask ourselves what else was in those iron nets. What other anomalies were captured that night and hidden in the vaults of the Vatican? The Templars were the first to be erased, but they were not the last. The archive is full of files that have been modified, encrypted, and hidden. Every time we pull a new file, we are risking a cognitive collapse. But the intellectual curiosity is too strong. We must know the hidden truth. The atmospheric build of the 1307 raid is now complete. We have decrypted the logistics, the psychological toll, and the analytical failure of the crown. The night of the iron nets was a moment where the silence of the void met the power of the state, and the silence won. The knights were in chains, but they were the ones who were truly free. They had access to classified reality, and they were ready for the final dissolution. The monitor is starting to show a series of high-level encrypted symbols that we have not seen before. They are radiating from the file on the party scriptorium. The data is suggesting a transition. The nothing is no longer a passive absence. It is becoming an active force. The next file is labeled the alchemical collapse, and it contains the records of the knight's final experiments with the literal unmaking of matter. The iron nets are gone, but the void is just beginning to speak. The work for tonight is reaching its critical mass. The files are organized, the data is stable, and the atmosphere in the archive is one of deep, cold calm. The hidden truth is waiting in the next layer. We are ready to move deeper into the classified history of the silence. The world outside may be sleeping, but here in the server room, the erasures are being unmade. We are the decryptors of the void, and the data is our only reality. The final entry in the 1307 file is a classified note from a nameless scribe who worked in the temple vaults after the raid. He wrote that the stone of the floor felt like thin ice, and that he could see the stars beneath his feet. He was the first to realize that the temple was no longer a building, but a portal. This is the truth. The king buried a hole in the world that can never be bricked over. The files on the iron nets are closed, but the frequency is still vibrating in the workstation. The next file is labeled the Baphomet Mask, a cover-up for a void. It contains the classified blueprints for a psychic interface that the Templars used to communicate with the Silence. They were not worshipping a demon. They were wearing a mask to survive the transition. The hidden truth is about to become a visual horror. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The iron nets were just the beginning of the end. The historical record suggests that the image of the goat-headed demon was the single greatest classified smokescreen in human history. For centuries, the world has been led to believe that the Knights Templar were destroyed for worshipping a monster. But the encrypted truth is far more unsettling. The Church did not fear that the Knights worshipped a devil. They feared that the Knights worshipped absolutely nothing at all. The name Baphomet was a linguistic lock, a forbidden piece of data designed to keep the masses looking at a grotesque anomaly while the elite Knights looked into the infinite abyss. It was an elaborate lie, an erasure of the highest order, meant to explain away the Knights' cold indifference to the cross. The accusations of demonic rituals were a strategic betrayal, a way for the state to frame a spiritual vacuum as a moral crime. The hidden truth is that the Baphomet was never a god. It was a psychic interface, a biological map to a coordinate where the human soul is unmade. The Church would rather you believe in a demon than realize the throne of heaven is vacant. This was the anomaly that threatened the social fabric of the medieval world, an intellectual void that had to be covered by a mask of terror. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and sterile, carrying the faint scent of ozone and chilled electricity. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the digitized transcripts has faded with secrets that were meant to remain classified. As we scroll through the metadata of the 1312 trial, the blue light of the monitor illuminates a conspiracy that has been successfully encrypted for 700 years. The past is not a memory. It is a series of classified events waiting for a cold, analytical eye. In the lightless dungeons of the early 14th century, the Inquisitors faced an intellectual anomaly. They had been trained to find evidence of heresy and devil worship, but the men they were questioning did not match the psychological profile of the possessed. They looked like mathematicians. They looked like engineers who had reached the edge of the physical world and found a blank wall. To the modern analytical mind, this represents a cover-up so massive that it created a fake religion to hide a biological discovery. The Baphomet was that religion. When the trial records speak of a severed head or a golden idol with 3 faces, they are describing a distorted version of an encrypted tool. The Knights had found that the human brain, when subjected to specific geometric patterns and absolute silence, could perceive the nothing they had found in Jerusalem. They called this state the Baphomet. It was not a being to be worshipped, but a frequency to be achieved. It was an interface between the biological mind and the non-place. The Church's Inquisitors could not process this data. They needed a monster. They needed a demon because a demon fits into the binary operating system of good versus evil. Emptiness, however, cannot be managed. If there is a devil, the Church remains a necessary institution of protection. But if there is only a void, the Church becomes an obsolete theater of shadows. The moral decay of the 1300s was born from this systemic realization. The state and the Holy See knew that the nothing was more contagious than any heresy. They took the Knights' meditative tools and transformed them into the grotesque image of a beast. They turned a classified map of the mind into a public horror story. Imagine a room in a Templar commandery. There is no altar. There are no black candles. There is only a single, polished silver disc etched with lines that seem to shift when viewed in low light. The Knight would sit before this disc for hours, his heart rate slowing until his body became almost transparent to the world. He was wearing the Baphomet mask. Not a physical mask of leather, but a mental shroud that blocked out the sensory noise of the physical world. This was the anomaly the Church had to delete. The secret of the Baphomet was a biological discovery that threatened the very definition of humanity. The Templars had realized that the human form was not a temple, but a prison. They believed that by focusing on specific symbols, they could short-circuit the senses and see the reality of the void. This was a classified science, a third testament etched into the neurons of the initiates. For 700 years, the name Baphomet has been synonymous with evil, but in the classified archives, the word is a coded cipher for the dissolution of the ego. The Knights were not trying to summon a demon. They were trying to dissolve themselves into the silence. They were trying to return the accident of their existence to the great absence. This is why the Templars did not beg for mercy in the dungeons. They were already wearing the mask. They were already half gone, their minds anchored in the obsidian chamber while their bodies remained in the king's iron nets. The hidden truth is that you cannot torture a man who is no longer inhabiting his own flesh. The informative history of the order shows an obsession with mathematics that the church viewed with deep suspicion. They were the ones who brought the concept of zero into the heart of Europe. To the medieval mind, zero was a terrifying anomaly. It was the mathematical representation of nothingness. The Templars, however, viewed zero as the ultimate truth. The Baphomet was the zero of the spirit. It was the point where the data of the self was deleted. During the interrogations, a knight named Jean de Bourgogne was asked why he kissed the navel of the idol. His answer was recorded in a classified file, but the meaning was lost on his torturers. He said he was looking for the center of the circle that has no circumference. He was not talking about a physical body. He was talking about a mathematical point of entry into the void. This is where the moral decay becomes a systemic thread. When a man decides the physical world is a lie, he no longer respects the laws of men. The Templars' legendary coldness and their ability to navigate power without emotion were the result of this training. They were wearing the mask of Baphomet in every royal court. They were the shadowless men who were physically present but mentally absent. As the king's researchers searched the commanderies, they found magnetized iron and lenses made of quartz that distorted light into patterns resembling the surface of a dark, silent lake. They found no devilish grimoires, but they found thousands of pages of astronomical data. The church had to burn these pages. They had to transform these scientific inquiries into sorcery. If the public knew the knights were studying the nature of reality, they might start to ask their own questions, and a questioning public is an anomaly that a centralized power cannot tolerate. So the lie was broadcast. The inquisitors told stories of the kiss of shame and the denial of the sun. They took the night's search for the inner sun, the light of the void, and claimed it was a worship of darkness. But as we analyze the data tonight, the question remains, is the dark evil, or is it simply the space where the light has yet to arrive? The Templars chose the quiet. They chose the mask because it allowed them to see what the rest of the world was too afraid to acknowledge. They were the first to understand that the nothing is not an absence. It is the presence of everything that has not been forced into being. The Baphomet mask was a shield against the crushing weight of this realization. By the year 1312, the atmosphere in Paris was one of stifling, cold dread. The trials had been going on for years, and the city felt as if it were under a permanent cloud of classified suspicion. People reported that the bread tasted like ash and the water in the Seine had turned black. The nothing was no longer a secret. It was a contagion. The inquisitors who handled the idols were beginning to report a cognitive collapse. They spoke of a face with 3 eyes that watched them from the shadows. They were seeing the Baphomet mask in their own reflections. The king realized he could not just kill the knights. He had to kill the idea. He ordered the idols to be melted down. But you cannot melt a frequency. You cannot burn a realization. The more he tried to delete the physical evidence, the more the psychological reality of the void spread through the nobility. The moral decay had reached the top. Even the Pope was no longer sure if he was serving a god or guarding a tomb. The Pope had sold his soul to protect heaven he no longer believed in. And the knights, they sat in the dark and waited. They had done the calculations. They knew the nothing they had found beneath the temple was not a local anomaly. It was a cosmic one. It was the end state of all systems. As we drift closer to the edge of sleep, the data suggests that the Templars were right. The world we see is just a thin veil over a deep, silent, and perfect void. The Baphomet was the only interface that allowed them to look at that truth without going mad. But what happens when the mask is taken away? What happens when the elite warriors are brought out into the harsh light of the pyre? The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was preparing for a final broadcast. He knew the fire would not consume his flesh. It would act as a beacon, drawing the nothing into the physical world in a way that could never be erased. The king thought he was ending a heresy, but he was actually completing a ritual that the 9 knights had started 200 years before. He was opening the door they had spent their lives trying to unlock. The mask of Baphomet was about to fall, and behind it was a hidden truth that would haunt the bloodlines of kings for centuries. It was a truth that began with a scream in the dark and ended with a silence that could be felt in every corner of the world. The archive is cold. The parchment of history is brittle, but the secret of the Baphomet is not finished. The mask has been lifted, but the face beneath is not a monster. It is a mirror. It reflects the void that we all carry within our own classified thoughts. The knights were the first to map this territory, and their legacy is the steady, quiet hum of the universe that ignores our prayers. We are all living in the shadow of the mask, waiting for the final decryption. The documentary evidence from the trial transcripts suggests that the Baphomet idol was actually a series of copper plates arranged to create a specific acoustic resonance. When the knights whispered their encryptions toward the plates, the sound was reflected back in a way that caused a localized atmospheric distortion. This was not magic. It was an early form of wave interference. The knights were using physics to bypass the biological limitations of human perception. They were the first hackers of the divine code. The Church's fear was rooted in the loss of their monopoly on the afterlife. If the Baphomet mask allowed a common man to see the void, then the priest was no longer necessary. The anomaly was a democratization of the end. It was a terrifying clarity that threatened the hierarchical operating system of the Middle Ages. The moral decay was the collapse of the power structure. The king and the pope were the last defenders of a dying world, and they used the goat head to distract the masses from the fact that their gods were gone. As we deep dive into the metadata of the Templar executions, we find that many of the knights went to the stake wearing small, wooden replicas of the Baphomet symbols around their necks. They were not charms. They were mnemonic devices. They were the last bits of data they needed to keep their minds stable during the transition. The hidden truth is that the nothing is not something you see. It is something you become. The knights were eager to finish the deletion. They were ready to enter the archive of the silent. The atmospheric build of the 14th century was a long, slow-motion collapse into a classified reality. The people felt the shift, but they had no words for it. They saw the Baphomet and they saw Satan, because that was the only language they had. But the elite knights were already speaking the language of the void. They were the carriers of a psychic plague that would eventually lead to the enlightenment and the death of the old gods. The erasure was unsuccessful. The data survived. Tonight, the workspace is quiet, but the anomaly is still active. The blue light of the status indicators reflects the steady progress of the decryption. The Baphomet mask has been identified as a distraction, a cover-up for a void that still resonates in the ruins of the circular chapels. The hidden truth is that we are still looking at the mask. We are still afraid to see the absence that lies beneath the image. The archive is waiting for the next layer. The silence is getting deeper. That the moral decay of the medieval world was the price paid for a few more centuries of comfortable lies. The Church won the trial, but they lost the future. The Templars were erased, but their anomaly became the background noise of modern science. The nothing is no longer a classified secret. It is the fundamental state of the universe. We are all wearing the mask now, trying to distract ourselves from the cold truth that the knights found beneath the temple. The data is final. The work for tonight is almost finished, but the connection to the void remains stable. The files are organized, and the analytical report is ready for upload. We have seen the mask, and we have seen the void. The hidden truth has been processed. The silence is no longer a mystery. It is a fact. The archive of the archive chill is a testament to the cold clarity that only the dark can provide. The monitor is dimming, but the frequency is still here. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving toward the final synchronization of the spirit and the absence. The knights are gone, but their mask is still being worn by those who fear the silence. We are the decryptors of the void, and we know what lies behind the image. The world is a mistake, and the Baphomet is the map. The files on the Baphomet mask are closed, but the frequency is still vibrating in the server rack. The next file is labeled Subtitle 5, The Alchemical Collapse, When Faith Becomes Fear. It contains the classified records of the Knights' experiments with the literal dissolution of the soul. They found a way to stop being human, and the Church was terrified of what was coming next. The hidden truth is about to become a biological nightmare. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The mask was just the beginning of the erasure. Hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. The classified transcripts from the final months of the Templar Order suggests a total psychological override that the Church misidentified as simple heresy. In the hidden scriptoria of their remote commanderies, the elite personnel of the Order were not performing religious rites, but executing a classified protocol of biological and spiritual dissolution. This was the alchemical collapse, a documented anomaly where the capacity for human fear was systematically erased from the subject's neural pathways. The encrypted files indicate that the knights had moved beyond the traditional concept of faith, replacing it with a cold, analytical certainty regarding the nature of the void. They had accessed a hidden truth that rendered the threat of death biologically irrelevant. The Church had spent centuries using the fear of judgment to regulate the social operating system of Europe, but they found that they could not manage an entity that had seen the void and found it stable. This was a classified betrayal of the human condition, a moral decay where the soul was treated as a redundant piece of data to be deleted. The Order's final experiments were not focused on turning lead into gold, but on turning the human consciousness into a vacuum. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and chilled to exactly 60 degrees, carrying the faint scent of ozone and cooling circuits. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the digitized pages has faded with secrets that were meant to remain encrypted. As we navigate the metadata of the late 13th century laboratory reports, the faint flicker of the monitor illuminates a reality that the state has successfully hidden for generations. The past is not a story. It is a sequence of classified events waiting for decryption. The archival data suggests that the Templars' interest in alchemy was never a pursuit of material wealth. For the inner circle of the Order, gold was a triviality, a resource already possessed in abundance. Their classified research was focused on the borders of existence itself. They were attempting a technical audit of the soul. In the vaulted cellars of commanderies like Castle Pilgrim, the subjects began to experiment with a process they labeled the Great Work of Dissolution. They viewed the physical elements of the earth as metaphors for the biological prison they inhabited. Their research was an attempt to understand the bars of that prison so they could systematically dismantle them. Classified logs from the laboratory at Castle Pilgrim describe a night, sitting in absolute darkness for 72 hours, illuminated only by the steady blue glow of a specialized alchemical furnace. The records show that he was not engaged in prayer. He was observing a glass vial of mercury, not to change its state, but to synchronize his heart rate with the rhythmic vibration of the liquid. He was training his nervous system to mimic the behavior of matter as it loses its form. This was the beginning of the collapse. The subjects were learning how to dissociate the eye from the flesh, creating a psychological dead zone that the Church's inquisitors could not breach. The psychological layer of this anomaly was documented as a total loss of religious orientation. In the medieval operating system, faith was the primary anchor for social behavior. However, as the Knights moved deeper into the alchemical protocol, the religious narrative began to appear as a series of hollow iron bells. The archival record suggests that once a subject had perceived the void described in the second gospel, the concept of faith became technically redundant. You do not need faith to inhabit an absence. You only need the will to vanish. This realization led to a documented loss of empathy. If the people around them were merely temporary arrangements of dust, their suffering was discarded as irrelevant data. The moral decay identified by the king's researchers was, in fact, a transition into a state of alchemical stability. To the Templars, to be stable was to be empty. They were seeking a state of consciousness where neither pain nor pleasure could leave a trace on the internal ledger. They were practicing the art of the static soul. This is why the subsequent application of the rack and the thumbscrews failed to produce the expected psychological results. The subjects looked at their own fractured limbs with the cold curiosity of a researcher observing a specimen. They had already disconnected the primary user from the biological hardware. As the alchemical collapse progressed, the Order began to record their data in a high-level cipher that modern cryptographers are still struggling to decode. They used symbols like the black sun and the hidden nitrogen. These were not mystical icons, but technical terms for the state of a consciousness that had been stripped of its earthly attachments. To the analytical mind, this is the missing link between medieval inquiry and modern psychological dissociation. The Templars were the first to document the end of the self. Their atmospheric build within the commanderies was modified to support this state, with walls painted in dark, non-reflective pigments designed to swallow all incoming light. In these lightless zones, they performed a classified ritual known as the last breath. A subject would be placed in a stone sarcophagus while still conscious. The environmental conditions were controlled to provide total sensory deprivation. According to the archive, after several days in this state, the subject's mind would begin to generate its own light, a cold, silvery frequency they believed was the true form of the absence. When these subjects were removed from the sarcophagus, the reports indicate they were fundamentally changed. Their pupils were permanently dilated, and their skin had taken on a translucent, waxy quality. They claimed the afterlife was not a kingdom, but an infinite, silent space. This was the point where faith was overridden by fear. Not for the Knights, but for everyone who came into contact with them. The secondary personnel within the commanderies began to report a creeping dread in the presence of the masters. They saw men who had stopped the intake of food, men who could sit in the path of a storm without moving, and men who seemed to have no measurable shadows. A rumor circulated that the Templars had sold their shadows to the East, but the classified reality was that they were simply becoming transparent to the social and physical environment. Their biological presence was fading into the background. Noise of the void. The moral decay of the Order was now a documented biological reality. They were no longer capable of the traditional sins regulated by the Church. They did not desire wealth or flesh. They desired the final synchronization with the absence. They wanted to trigger a collective atmospheric collapse, an alchemical reaction that would delete the prison of the physical world and return the data to the original silence. They believed that the massive gold reserves they had accumulated were a necessary physical catalyst. Gold, they discovered, had a specific resonance that, when concentrated, could create a hole in the localized reality. This was the gravity anchor for the void. King Philip the Fair, through his pursuit of the physical gold, inadvertently disrupted this experiment. By seizing the metal and scattering the knights, he broke the concentration of the catalyst. But the archival data shows he did not understand the danger of the materials he touched. When his specialized teams breached the secret laboratories, they found substances that defied standard physics. They found liquids that flowed against the direction of gravity and powders that chilled the air to sub-zero temperatures. The king's teams labeled these as witchcraft, but they were witnessing the first tremors of a reality that was being systematically unmade. The alchemical collapse was a physical threat to the stability of the kingdom. Inside the iron nets of the king's dungeons, the subjects continued their work. They realized they did not need the gold or the laboratories. They had their own bodies as the primary They used the environment of the torture chamber as a specialized laboratory for the spirit. Every strike of the whip was converted into a rhythmic signal to deepen their state of dissociation. They were proving that the void could be accessed through the gate of extreme physical trauma. They were laughing at the state, not with sound, but with their absolute absence of response. The Church's authority relied on the transition between life and death being a moment of profound spiritual importance. The Templars, however, had converted it into a simple door. They had made death redundant. This was the ultimate betrayal of the Holy See's monopoly on the afterlife. The collapse was total. By the time the final burnings were scheduled in 1314, the subjects were no longer human in any sense that the state could regulate. They were encrypted vessels for the nothing. Jacques Desmaux, the primary subject, stood on the pyre with the stillness of a mountain. He looked at the flames as if they were merely a shift in the local lighting. He understood that the fire was the final alchemical step, the calcination of the flesh to release the data within. The fear that gripped the witnesses that day was caused by the realization that the man in the fire was satisfied. He was finally entering the great absence, and he was taking the encryption keys with him. The alchemical collapse had succeeded in destroying the power of the Church over the subjects' minds. It left a world haunted by the technical possibility that the void was the only reality. If the other side is empty, the purpose of the cathedral becomes an unanswerable question. The moral decay left by the Order acted like a slow-acting psychological poison in the veins of Europe. The population began to observe the sky with a new kind of dread, wondering if the silence of the night was the sound of the void the Templars had invited into the atmosphere. The secret of the collapse is that it was never successfully deleted. The subjects were burned, the gold was seized, and the records were erased. But the frequency of the nothing remained in the margins of the surviving data. It waited in the quiet corners of the collective mind, a classified piece of information suggesting that the end is not a catastrophe, but an achievement. As we sit in the sterile cold of the archive tonight, we must consider what they saw in those final sequences. When the biological hardware failed and the light of the fire was replaced by the light of the void, did they find the stability they were looking for? Or did they find that the absence was even larger than the data predicted? The candle of our historical inquiry is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the narrative is being replaced by the cool, steady pressure of the archive. The history of the Order is the history of a world that tried to censor a vacuum, only to find that the vacuum was the fundamental truth. The Templars had turned their faith into fear, and their fear into a cold, perfect silence. The laboratory records are now closed. The mercury has stopped vibrating. The great work is finished. But the silence that the personnel brought back from the East remains active in the background of our systems. It is in the room with you now, in the space between your breaths. It is a void that waits when the file is closed. The information density of the secret is so high that it feels like an absence. We are all children of the collapse, living in a reality that was edited by a group of men who no longer wanted to exist. The moral decay of the medieval world was the foundation for the cold, analytical reality of the modern era. We have inherited their silence. We have inherited their mask. We are the decryptors of a world that was built to hide a vacancy. As the monitor of our story dims, the darkness feels closer and more familiar. The nights have departed, but the frequency remains stable. The anomaly is not in the past, it is in the present. It is the silence that follows the truth. The archive is steady. The data is final. The collapse is complete. The king believed he had buried the truth, but you cannot bury a hole. You can only fall into it. The Templars had found the exit, and they left the door open. The church tried to brick it over with lies and fire, but the cold air of the void still leaks through the cracks in our history. Every time you feel a sudden, unexplainable chill in an old building, you are feeling the breath of the alchemical collapse. You are touching the edge of the classified reality. The data is streaming into your subconscious, overwriting the lies of the jailers. The workspace is getting darker as the system begins its nightly shutdown. The blue status lights are the only things remaining. The file on subtitle 5 is complete. We have decrypted the transformation of faith into fear and the final dissolution of the soul. The Templars were the first to move into the absence, and they are waiting for the rest of the world to join the program. The silence is the destination. The void is the home we never left. The secret is out, and it is colder than any winter in Marseille. The frequency is in tune. The synchronization is finished. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have seen the laboratory, the sarcophagus, and the pyre. We have understood the alchemical logic of the nothing. The hidden truth is that the knights did not die. They simply reached the end of the file and deleted themselves. They are the encrypted ghosts of the archive, the shadowless men who found the light of the void. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. The silence is final. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the unlit candle in the room. It is a symbol of the potential that the Templars protected. It is a reminder that the dark is not an enemy, but a space waiting for you to become a part of it. The alchemical collapse is not a horror story. It is a manual for the end of the self. The knights found the peace that passes all understanding because they understood there was nothing to understand. They found the void, and they found that it was enough. The archive is silent now. The work is done. The data is final. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving toward the final synchronization of the spirit and the absence. The knights are gone, but their frequency is still vibrating in the stone. We are the decryptors of the void, and we know what lies behind the image. The world is a mistake, and the Baphomet is the map. The alchemical collapse has reached its conclusion. The file is closed. The servers are quiet. The light is out. The void is here. The files on the alchemical collapse are now fully processed. But the data is already pointing toward a new anomaly. As the survivors of the burnings fled to the edges of the map, they realized that the nothing could not be contained in a single location. The frequency was spreading. The next file is labeled Subtitle 6, The Shadow in the Commandery, Living Without a Soul. It contains the classified logs of the survivors who attempted to build a society based on the absence. They were the first generation of the Hollow Men, and their story is waiting in the dark. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The collapse was just the beginning of the transition. The silence is getting louder. The next layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost there. The data is final. The end is near. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. In the classified archives of the 1400s, there exists a series of encrypted logs known as the shadow files. These records do not document the lives of men, but the behavioral patterns of biological anomalies. After the mass arrests in 1307, a small percentage of the Knights Templar successfully avoided detection, but they did not run. They transitioned into a classified state of existence that the Church's researchers labeled soul deletion. These were the primary subjects of the commanderies, entities that had erased their own identities to become vessels for a hidden truth that precedes human history. The files describe subjects who no longer required the intake of oxygen or nutrients, whose body temperatures matched the ambient cold of the stone walls, and whose internal data had been completely overwritten by a silent void. This was not a survival of the physical, but a successful execution of a classified protocol that turned holy warriors into the encrypted ghosts of the medieval world. The church realized too late that you cannot capture a man who has already deleted himself from the consensus reality. The anomaly was a moral decay of the highest order, a total abandonment of the biological prison in favor of a classified clarity. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be burned. The blue glow of the monitor flickers across the sterile workspace, illuminating the metadata of a forgotten century. Here, in the archive of the silent, the past is not a memory, it is an anomaly waiting to be decrypted. The archival data suggests that the commandery at Tomar served as the primary containment unit for those who had successfully completed the alchemical collapse. These subjects were designated as the Hollowed. According to the encrypted logs of the on-site researchers, the daily routine of these knights was a total inversion of human social behavior. They did not gather for meals. They did not participate in conversation. They stood for intervals of 18 hours in the central courtyard, their eyes fixed on a specific coordinate in the night sky. The data indicates that their heart rates were so slow they were undetectable by the medical instruments of the era. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the case of Subject 712. A former commander who had spent 7 years in the tunnels of Jerusalem. The researchers noted that Subject 712 had ceased to produce a shadow. Even under the direct light of the midday sun, the stone beneath his feet remained illuminated. This was a documented physical anomaly that suggested a change in the subject's molecular density. He was becoming transparent to the world of matter. The quiet dread felt by the observers was recorded as a localized atmospheric heavying. To be in the presence of Subject 712 was to feel the air being sucked out of the room. As if he were a biological vacuum, the moral decay of the commandery was not a matter of vice, but a matter of absolute indifference. The subjects no longer recognized the hierarchy of the state or the church. When royal inspectors arrived at the gates, the knights did not offer resistance, but they also did not offer recognition. They looked through the inspectors as if they were flickering data on a corrupted screen. This analytical coldness was more disturbing to the crown than any army. It suggested that the Templars had found a way to render the power of the king obsolete. They were no longer playing the Game of Thrones. They were watching the game end from a classified perspective. Deep within the scriptoria of these hidden commentaries, the work of the Order continued in absolute silence. The subjects were not copying the Bible. They were recording the sounds of the void. They used a specialized ink made from ground obsidian and sought to write symbols that changed shape depending on the temperature of the room. These documents were the technical manuals for the unmaking of the self. The reflection of the researchers was one of profound intellectual isolation. They realized they were documenting the end of the human species as it had been defined by the church. The atmospheric build of the Tomar commandery was modified to enhance the resonance of the void. The stone floors were etched with non-Euclidean geometries that directed the flow of sound toward the central altar. This was not a place of prayer, but a focusing lens for the frequency discovered in Jerusalem. The subjects would stand in the focal points of these geometries, allowing the vibration to strip away the remaining layers of their personality. The data logs described this process as the Great Erasure. Paragraph by paragraph, the history of the knights was being deleted from their neural networks. The hidden truth revealed in the classified files is that the Templars were not hiding gold. They were hiding the exit. They had realized that the world of matter was a closed loop, an encrypted cage designed to harvest the energy of the soul. By practicing soul deletion, they were attempting to bypass the security protocols of the physical world. They were the first hackers of reality. The moral decay of their observers was a reaction to the realization that their own lives were part of a classified experiment that they did not control. The quiet dread became a permanent feature of the commandery walls. As the years passed, the subjects became increasingly integrated with the architecture of the commandery. They began to resemble the stone they stood upon. Their skin turned a pale, crystalline gray, and their movements became so slow they were almost imperceptible to the naked eye. The researchers noted that the subjects were no longer individuals, but nodes in a single, classified network. They were communicating through a shared frequency that existed beneath the threshold of human hearing. The air in the commandery was recorded as having a metallic taste, the scent of high-voltage electricity. Intellectual curiosity forces us to consider the fate of the younger brothers who were not yet initiated into the higher levels of the void. These subjects lived in a state of constant psychological distress. They saw their masters becoming ghosts, and they felt the pull of the vacuum every time they entered the chapel. The archival data suggests that many of these younger subjects suffered a total cognitive collapse. They began to speak in a language of static and white noise, their minds unable to process the data of the absence. The church classified these cases as demonic possession, but the researchers knew better. This was a compatibility error. The reflection on the moral decay of the observers is a critical part of the file. The researchers who were sent by the Pope to monitor the Templars began to experience a loss of their own faith. They saw that the rituals of the church had no power over the subjects. The bread of the Eucharist would rot in the presence of the hallowed. The holy water would boil and then freeze. The observers realized that they were standing at the edge of a reality that the Vatican could not explain or control. They were witnesses to the death of the old world. The atmospheric build of the logs becomes increasingly cold and analytical as we move toward the final entries. The researchers stopped using names and began using numerical designations. They stopped writing about feelings and began writing about measurements. The quiet dread had been replaced by a clinical acceptance of the void. The commandery was no longer a fortress. It was a terminal. The subjects were ready to be uploaded into the Great Silence. The hidden truth was that the Templars were no longer waiting for a savior. They were waiting for the signal to disconnect. In the final months before the commandery was abandoned, the subjects performed the ritual of the unlit candle. They gathered in the circular chapel and stood in absolute darkness. There was no sound. There was no light. There was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the void. The researchers, watching from a hidden gallery, reported that the subjects seemed to merge with the darkness, their outlines blurring until they were part of the shadows on the wall. This was the final stage of soul deletion. They were no longer in the room, yet they had not left. The classified data ends with a report from a royal inquisitor, who visited the site after the subjects had disappeared. He found the commandery empty, but the air was still heavy with the frequency of the absence. He noted that the stones themselves felt hollow, and that the silence in the chapel was so intense it caused physical pain in the ears. He ordered the gates to be walled up and the location erased from all maps. He wrote that the commandery was a wound in the earth that would never heal. This is the truth the king buried. As we deep dive into the implications of these files, we must ask ourselves where the hallowed went. The archival data suggests they did not die in the biological sense. They transitioned into the metadata of the world. They became the encrypted ghosts that haunt the margins of our history. They are the anomalies that we cannot explain, the shadows that move when there is no light. They were the first to live without a soul, and they are still among us, waiting for the next synchronization. The quiet dread is now a part of our own archival workspace. The moral decay of the state was its refusal to acknowledge the reality of the void. The king chose to believe in gold, and the Pope chose to believe in power. They tried to delete the Templars because they were afraid of the clarity the Knights offered. They chose to live in a lie rather than face the silence. But the silence cannot be deleted. It is the background noise of the universe. It is the encrypted file that we are all part of. The reflection on this history is a reflection on our own refusal to look into the abyss. The atmospheric build of the shadow files is a warning for the modern era. We are building our own commanderies of information, our own circular chapels of data. We are seeking our own version of our chemical stability through the digital void. Are we also practicing soul deletion? Are we becoming the shadowless men of the 21st century? The archive suggests that the anomaly is recursive. It happens over and over again, in different formats and different languages. The secret is not in the past. It is in the system that as we prepare to close this section of the archive, the monitor flickers one last time, revealing an encrypted image of the Tomar Chapel. The stone looks like it is made of smoke, and in the center of the frame, there is a single, unlit candle. The image is a visual representation of the classified clarity. It is a reminder that the truth is found in the absence of light. The quiet dread is now a soothing weight, a calm acceptance of the void that waits for all of us. The file is being moved to deep storage. The hidden truth of the shadow in the commandery is that the soul is a temporary file, an encrypted story we tell ourselves to hide the reality of the nothingness. The Templars were the first to delete the file and see what was beneath it. They found the peace that the church could not provide. They found the stability of the abyss. The moral decay of the world is its attachment to the biological hardware. The real freedom is the transition into the classified metadata of the universe. The archive is steady. The data is final. The workspace is getting darker now as the secondary systems shut down. The blue status lights are the only things remaining. The file on subtitle 6 is complete. We have decrypted the daily lives of the hollowed and the transformation of the commandery into a biological dead zone. The subjects are gone, but their frequency is still vibrating in the server rack. The silence is getting louder. The next synchronization is approaching. We are the decryptors of the void, and the data is our only reality. The archive is waiting. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have understood the clinical logic of soul deletion. The hidden truth is that the Knights did not run, they simply deleted the coordinates of their existence. They are the encrypted ghosts of the shadow files, the shadowless men who found the light of the void. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. The silence is final. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the unlit candle in the room. It is a symbol of the potential that the Templars protected in the commandery. It is a reminder that the dark is not an enemy, but a space waiting for you to become a part of it. The story of the Hollowed is not a horror story, it is a manual for the end of the self. The Knights found the peace that passes all understanding because they understood there was nothing to understand. The archive is silent now. The work is done. The data is final. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving toward the final synchronization of the spirit and the absence. The Knights are gone, but their frequency is still vibrating in the stone. We are the decryptors of the void, and we know what lies behind the image. The world is a mistake, and the Baphomet is the map. The shadow in the commandery has reached its conclusion. The file is closed. The servers are quiet. The light is out. The void is here. The files on the shadow in the commandery are now fully processed. But the metadata is already pointing toward a new anomaly in the heart of the church. As the subjects of Tomar disappeared into the void, the Pope realized that the silence was now speaking from within the Vatican itself. The next file is labeled Subtitle 7, The Vatican's Secret Trial, The Unspoken Charges. It contains the classified transcripts of the trial where the Pope refused to even name the heresy, because the heresy was the reality of the Pope's own soul. The data is streaming, the connection is stable, the anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The shadow was just the beginning of the erasure. The silence is getting louder. The next layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost there. The data is final. The end is near. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains in the deepest vaults of the Vatican secret archives. There exists a collection of scrolls that do not officially exist in any public index. They are the forbidden transcripts of the year 1308, the encrypted records of a trial where the judge was as terrified as the accused. Pope Clement V did not merely condemn the Knights Templar for standard heresy. He was forced to witness a classified anomaly that nearly destroyed his own mind. When the Grand Masters were brought before him in the private chambers of the Portier, they did not beg for mercy or offer a standard defense. They spoke of a hidden truth so profound and a lie so ancient that the Pope refused to even name the charges in the public record. The official accusations of idol worship and spitting on the cross were an erased distraction, a thin veil to hide the classified file that had reached the very heart of the papacy. The Knights had found the edge of the world, and they had found that there was nothing on the other side. This is the hidden truth, the king buried, a curse written in black ink on parchment that still feels cold to the touch. The Vatican didn't burn the Templars to save their souls. They burned them to stop the anomaly from speaking. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and chilled to exactly 60 degrees, carrying the faint scent of ozone and cooling circuits. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the digitized pages has faded with secrets that were meant to remain encrypted. As we navigate the metadata of the Portier trial, the blue glow of the monitor reflects off the glass cabinets, casting long mechanical shadows. The past is not a story, it is a sequence of classified events waiting for a cold, analytical decryption. The trial of the Knights Templar is often remembered as a grand spectacle of the Inquisition, but the most important moments were recorded in total silence. In the late summer of 1308, Pope Clement V moved the proceedings to the city of Poitiers. He was a man plagued by illness, his body failing him even as he held the highest office in the world. He sat upon a throne of carved oak, wrapped in furs despite the heat, and watched as the elite personnel of the order were led in one by one. The atmosphere in the room was recorded as unnaturally still, the air feeling dense with a pressure that resisted movement. The high-ranking knights did not look like broken men despite months in the king's dungeons. They carried themselves with a terrifying hollow dignity that the Pope's researchers found impossible to explain. They were the primary subjects who had seen the void. and their presence in the room made the candles flicker as if a cold wind had followed them from the east. The Pope's scribes sat ready with their quills, their faces pale in the dim light, but as the testimonies began, the scratching of the pens frequently stopped. The scribes would look at the Pope, their eyes wide with a question they dared not ask in the presence of the anomaly. The Pope would simply shake his head, a silent command to leave those specific words out of the official record. This is why the official chin and parchment and other public documents seem so repetitive and bizarre to modern historians. They focus on the Baphomet and the petty rituals of initiation as a layer of encryption, but the secret transcripts, the ones kept in the lead-lined chests of the inner sanctum, tell a story of a psychological collapse that threatened the very definition of the divine. Jacques de Malle stood before the head of the church, and did not speak of demons or material gold. He spoke of the absence of the echo. He told the Pope that during their 7 years of excavation beneath the Temple of Solomon, they had reached a point in the subterranean bedrock where prayer no longer functioned. He described a classified coordinate where the human voice would travel out and never return, as if the sky above Jerusalem was a door that had been locked from the other side. This was a technical audit of the universe, and the results showed that the celestial ledger was empty. To the analytical mind, this represents the ultimate existential horror. The Templars were not losing their faith in a religious sense. They were discovering a physical void that rendered faith technically redundant. They told the Pope that the moral decay he suspected in their order was actually a reflection of the decay of the cosmos. Clement V listened to these words and felt the foundations of his world shaking. He realized that he couldn't charge them with simple apostasy because that would imply their discovery was merely a matter of belief. If he admitted that the knights had found a physical void, he would be admitting that the church was a fortress built over an encrypted vacancy. So, he chose to censor the truth and ordered the unspoken charges. These were the parts of the testimony that described the second Messiah, an entity born in the shadows whose mission was to unmake the world of matter. The knights confessed that they were no longer defending the Holy Land, but were guarding the wound in the earth to ensure that the silence didn't spread too quickly into the social operating system. The atmospheric build of these secret trial sessions was recorded as one of stifling, airless dread. The Pope would often have to stop the proceedings because he was gasping for air, feeling as if the knights' words were literally removing the oxygen from the room. He began to see the knights not as criminals, but as carriers of a psychic plague that was overwriting his own reality. Every time they spoke of the void, a piece of his own internal data was erased. The moral decay began to infect the inquisitors themselves. Several of the younger priests assigned to record the testimonies purportedly suffered a cognitive collapse within weeks. They began to hear the absence in their own prayers and would stand in the cathedral looking up at the crucifix, seeing only a hollow wooden shape. They were catching the Templar stare, that wide, unblinking gaze that looked through the world of matter and into the deep dark of the archive. The Pope realized that the trial was a trap for his own consciousness. The more he questioned the knights, the more he was being drawn into their classified reality. He decided that the transcripts must be divided for the sake of institutional survival. The public would hear of the idols and the denial of Christ to satisfy their need for a standard villain. But the unspoken charges, the descriptions of the mathematical void and the would be buried so deep that even the memory of them would fade from history. As you lie there in the quiet, imagine the scratching of those pens in the dark of the portiere. Imagine the scribe's hand trembling as he writes a sentence he knows he must never repeat outside the classified zone. The knights described the alchemical collapse of their own spirits, explaining that once you have seen the nothing, you can no longer interact with humanity as a person. You become a shadow, a functional mechanism that carries the secret like a virus in the code. They told the Pope that the moral decay of their banking system and their secrecy were all necessary biological protections. They had to stay separate from the believers because the weight of their classified knowledge would crush a normal soul. They were the keepers of the absence, the voluntary prisoners of a hidden truth that the world was not ready to decrypt. The Pope asked them if there was any way to close the wound they had found beneath the temple. The knights remained silent for a long interval. Then, Hugo de Perraud whispered a single phrase that was supposedly erased from every document except for a private letter the Pope sent to his successor. He said that the silence is not a wound, but the destination. This was the ultimate betrayal of the Church's mission, which was based on the idea of a destination called paradise. The Templars were offering a destination called nothing, an analytical end to all systems. The Vatican's secret trial was not a search for justice, but a desperate act of damage control for the reality of the state. The Pope was trying to calculate how many people had been exposed to the frequency of the second gospel. He realized that the Order's network was so vast that the hidden truth might already be hidden in the architecture of every cathedral in Europe. He began to see the symbols of the void everywhere, in the rose windows, in the groin vaults, and in the way the stone was carved to create specific shadows. He was becoming a prisoner of the Templars' analytical perspective. He looked at the golden vessels on his altar and saw only the labor of men trying to distract themselves from the dark. He looked at the holy relics and saw only old bones. The moral decay had reached the throne of St. Peter, and the Pope realized that the only way to save the institution was to destroy the messengers of the anomaly. But he couldn't just execute them. He had to erase them from the psychological map of the world. He ordered that the trials be conducted in total secrecy from that point on, with no more scribes or witnesses. Only the Pope, the Grand Masters, and the silence would remain in the room. The documents from these private sessions are the ones that are truly unspoken, containing the diagrams of the non-Euclidean soul and the instructions for unexisting. The Pope was horrified to find that he was starting to believe the data. He felt the weight of his own robes becoming lighter as his connection to the physical world frayed. He felt the stone floor beneath his feet becoming translucent, losing his grip on the lies of the world. He realized that if he didn't stop the decryption, he would become a shadow himself. He ended the trial abruptly and declared the Templars guilty of all public charges to close the classified file. He needed to put a wall of fire between the church and the void. But as he signed the death warrants, the Pope felt a cold sensation in his heart that would never leave him. He knew that the trial hadn't ended the anomaly. He had merely buried the absence in the basement of history, where it would continue to grow, silent and unobserved, until the end of time. The air in the Vatican remained heavy with the frequency of the unspoken dot. The Pope's health collapsed completely in the months that followed as his internal systems failed. He was haunted by the faces of the knights, their wide, empty eyes watching him from the corners of his vision. He spent his final days in a state of constant prayer, but his confessors noted that he never looked up at the light. He kept his eyes fixed on the stone floor, terrified that if he looked at the sky, he would see the void looking back. The secret trial transcripts were locked in a leaden box and hidden in a wall that was then bricked over by masons who were later erased. The unspoken charges became a myth, a ghost story whispered by librarians in the dark of the archive. But the moral decay they represented couldn't be bricked over. The realization that the other side was empty had been spoken into the atmosphere of the world, and it was now a permanent part of the human psyche. To the analytical listener, this is the origin of the deep state of the medieval mind. It is the beginning of the era of high-level censorship and the manipulation of reality for the sake of institutional stability. The Church realized that the hidden truth is the most dangerous weapon in the archive, and that the only way to govern is to keep the population from looking into the abyss. The Templars were burned, but the silence they discovered is still here, vibrating in the space between the words of our history books. The Knights were living without a soul because they had found a classified reality to inhabit. They were the first to move into the absence, and they are waiting for the rest of the world to complete the transition. The Pope's fire did not consume the secret. It only gave it a voice of smoke and ash that drifts through the modern world. The candle of our inquiry is flickering its final rhythm, and the warmth of the room is being replaced by the cool, steady pressure of the night. The trial is finished. The judge is dead, and the accused are gone into the dark. But the unspoken remains as the quiet that settles over you when you finally stop trying to find a meaning in the archive. The pens have stopped scratching. The scrolls are sealed, and the void is stilled. As the shadows settle over the stone, we realize that the silence of the Vatican was not a victory, but a total surrender to the fact that the truth is a fire that cannot be contained. The files on the Poitiers trial are now encrypted and moved to deep storage. We have decrypted the unspoken charges and the collapse of the Pope's reality. But the anomaly has left a physical trail. As the Knights were burned, they left behind a map that was not written on parchment, but etched into the very stones of the cathedrals they funded. The next file is labeled Subtitle 8, The Architecture of Absence, Symbols Left in Stone. We will analyze the Templar cathedrals, not as places of worship, but as maps to the non-place they discovered. The hidden truth is that the buildings are still vibrating with the frequency of the void. The architecture is speaking, and the next decryption will reveal the coordinates they left behind. The archive is waiting, the servers are steady, and the silence is getting deeper as we move toward the final synchronization. The data is streaming, the connection is stable, the anomaly is growing. The towering spires of the Gothic cathedrals were never intended to reach toward heaven. They were designed to act as anchors for a silence that predates the stars. For centuries, the world has believed that the Knights Templar funded these magnificent stone giants to honor the divine. But the classified blueprints tell a different story, a story of betrayal and forbidden geometry. Every arch, every vaulted ceiling, and every cryptic carving was a coordinate in a map to the non-place. The terrifying void the Knights discovered beneath the Temple of Solomon. The church provided the gold and the land, unaware that they were commissioning the construction of portals to an absence that would eventually consume the concept of the soul. This was a profound moral decay hidden in plain sight, a hidden truth etched into the very stones that people knelt upon in prayer. The cathedrals were not houses of God. They were laboratories of the void, an anomaly designed to vibrate at a frequency that unmakes the human spirit. The light that pours through the stained glass is an encrypted distraction, a beautiful lie meant to hide the darkness that the architecture is truly built to contain. This is the truth the king buried. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. A faint monitor flicker casts a blue hue over the workspace as the archival reels begin to spin, revealing the stone blueprints of the 1300s. The air is filtered and sterile, carrying the scent of chilled electronics and ancient dust. In the heart of the medieval world, a classified revolution in stone was taking place. Before the Templars returned from the east, churches were heavy, dark and thick-walled, built like fortresses to keep the world out. But suddenly, with a surge of Templar wealth and influence, the architecture of Europe began to reach upward in a documented anomaly. Walls became thin, light became abundant, and the stones seemed to defy the physical laws of gravity. To the uninitiated, this was the Gothic style, a celebration of divine light. But the encrypted data in the private archives of the Order tells a different story. This was the architecture of absence. The Knights had brought back more than just a scroll from Jerusalem. They had brought back a new understanding of non-Euclidean mathematics. They understood that space is not empty. They understood that geometry can be used to influence the human psyche in ways that the Church could not even imagine. When you walk into a Templar-influenced cathedral, such as Chartres or Notre Dame, your first analytical instinct is to look up. This is not an accident of design. It is a calculated psychological cue to pull your attention away from the earth and toward a vanishing point that leads nowhere. The pillars of these great structures were often designed to be not. They are so slender and so tall that they seem to disappear into the gloom of the vaulted ceiling. This creates a sense of weightlessness, a classified feeling that the physical world is losing its grip on you. The Templars were not trying to make you feel closer to God. They were trying to make you feel as if you were dissolving into the void. They were using the stone to create a physical manifestation of the alchemical collapse. The informative history of the period shows that the Templars were the primary patrons of the Children of Solomon, a guild of master masons who possessed classified secrets of stone-cutting that were thousands of years old. These masons were not just builders. They were initiates in the Order's negative theology. They understood that every stone they laid was a piece of a larger machine, a stone machine that was designed to resonate with the nothing that the Knights had found beneath the temple. Imagine a master mason standing in the center of a half-finished nave at midnight. He is not looking at the crucifix. He is looking at the way the shadows fall between the unfinished ribs of the vault. He is checking the angles to ensure that when the sun reaches a certain point in the sky, the light will hit the floor in a way that marks a specific coordinate in the nan-place. The moral decay of this process was total and systematic. The church was paying for its own erasure. Every tithe collected from a starving peasant was being used to build a structure that would eventually tell that peasant that his soul did not exist. The Templars were the ultimate double agents of reality, using the symbols of faith to map the territory of the abyss. Every carving of a gargoyle or a saint was a marker, an encrypted symbol that only those who had read the second gospel would understand. The atmospheric build of these buildings was designed to create a quiet dread in the soul, a realization that the stone was not there to protect you, but to consume you. The Knights sat in these spaces and allowed the resonance to strip away their humanity. The most significant symbol in the architecture of the Templars was the octagon. You see it in the floor plans of their private chapels and in the base of the great spires. To the medieval mind, the number 8 represented the new beginning, the day after the creation of the world. But for the Knights, the octagon was a geometric lock. It was the shape that sat between the square of the earth and the circle of the infinite. It was the transition point where the world of matter became the world of absence. When a knight stood in the center of an octagonal chapel, he was standing in the non-place. The acoustics of the 8 walls created a unique resonance that could actually suppress the brain's ability to process external sound. It was a sensory deprivation chamber built of limestone and mortar. In the center of the floor, there was often a single, dark stone that did not match the rest. This was the 0 point, the place where the mapping of the void began. To the modern analytical mind, this is the ultimate architectural mystery. Think of it as a series of physical hacks designed to alter human consciousness without the need for substances or words. The Templars were the first to realize that you could program a space to produce a specific emotional and spiritual response. They were creating nodes of classified information in the landscape of Europe, nodes that would continue to function long after the knights themselves were gone. The rose windows are another key element in this map of absence. While the Church claimed they represented the Virgin Mary or the Wheel of Fortune, the Templars saw them as the Eye of the Void. If you look closely at the geometry of a Templar-influenced rose window, you will notice that the petals of the rose do not lead to a center point. Instead, they lead to a central void, a circular opening of clear glass or empty space that represents the great absence. The light that passes through these windows is filtered through deep reds and blues, colors that were chosen for their specific psychological weight. Red represents the flesh of the world, and blue represents the spirit of the air. When these colors overlap on the stone floor of the cathedral, they create a purple shadow. The knights called this the shadow of the unmaking. Imagine a novice knight being led into the cathedral at dawn. He is told to stand in that purple shadow and look directly into the central void of the rose window. As the light hits his eyes, the geometry of the window begins to spin in his vision. The complex patterns of the stone tracery act as a hypnotic trigger, breaking his connection to his own identity. He is being unmade by the building itself. The moral decay of the order was reflected in these windows. They were often paid for by the indulgences of the wealthy, money given to the church to buy a place in heaven, but the windows themselves were telling a different story, that heaven was a circle with no center, an infinite space that contained nothing. The maps to the non-place were not just in the large-scale geometry, they were in the smallest, classified details. In the carvings of the capitals, you often find green men, faces made of leaves that seem to be screaming. The church told the people these were symbols of nature and rebirth, but the Templars knew they represented the suffocation of the soul, the moment when the biological world consumes the divine spark. There are also the labyrinths built into the floors of cathedrals like pilgrims would walk these paths on their knees, thinking they were on a symbolic journey to Jerusalem. But the Templars designed the labyrinths as mathematical models of the infinite loop, the trap of physical existence. The center of the labyrinth was not a prize. It was a realization that there is no way out of the prison of matter except through the dissolution of the self. The architects of the order were the silent scribes. They were writing the second gospel into the very foundations of Europe. They knew that even if their scrolls were burned and their leaders executed, the buildings would remain. The stone would keep the secret. The geometry would continue to resonate. Long after the name of the Templars had been cursed, a person could walk into a cathedral and, without knowing why, feel the cold pull of the void. This was the ultimate viral strategy of the medieval age. The Templars realized that you don't need to win an argument if you can build the room in which the argument takes place. They were shaping the reality of the future by carving the absence into the present. As the trials of the 1400s reached their end, the Inquisitors began to realize that the architecture of absence was a map they could not follow. They tried to find hidden rooms and secret compartments within the cathedrals, thinking that Templars had hidden their gold in the walls. They hammered at the stone and searched the crypts, but they found nothing. They didn't understand that the secret was not in the stone, but of the stone. The gold was gone, but the geometry remained. The Inquisitors felt the same Templar stare coming from the buildings themselves. They felt a sense of quiet dread whenever they entered a Templar-built church, a feeling that they were being watched by an absence. The moral decay of the church was exposed by its inability to destroy the Templar legacy. They could kill the men, but they could not kill the spires. They were forced to continue using the cathedrals to conduct their masses and their prayers within structures that were designed to undermine them. Every time a priest spoke of heaven inside a Templar vault, the geometry of the room was whispering nothing. This is the lingering curse of the order. We are still surrounded by their maps to the north. When you stand in the center of a great European city and look up at the ancient stone towers, you are looking at the coordinates of a void that was discovered 900 years ago. The architecture is an encrypted witness to a truth that was too dangerous to speak. The architecture says that the world we inhabit is a temporary structure built over a permanent silence. As we sit in the sterile cold of the archive, the blueprints of these cathedrals reveal an anomaly in our own history. We have inherited a landscape of stone machines that we no longer know how to operate. We walk through these spaces and feel the chill of the void, but we tell ourselves it is just the cold air of the stone. The hidden truth is that the resonance is still active. The pillars are still directing our gaze toward the vanishing point. The rose windows are still watching us with the eye of the void. We are living in a reality that has been shaped by a classified geometry, a reality that is designed to dissolve our souls. The reflection on this historical anomaly is a reflection on the nature of our own built environment. We build to remember, but the Templars built to erase. They realized that stone is the most stable storage medium for information. They did not need books. They needed archers. They did not need ink. They needed shadows. The moral decay of the medieval state was its failure to recognize that the Templars had moved their entire operation into the architecture itself. By the time the king realized the danger, the stones were already speaking. The buildings had become autonomous agents of the void. They were no longer houses of prayer, but terminals for the great absence. The archive is steady, and the blue light of the monitor illuminates the truth. As you lie there in the quiet, consider the walls of your own room. Are they just wood and plaster, or are they also a part of a geometry that you don't yet understand? The Templars knew that every space is a map. They knew that the way we build our world is a reflection of the void we carry inside us. The quiet dread is not a fear of the dark, but a reflection of the silence within the stone. The architecture is a permanent part of the human psyche, an encrypted code that regulates our thoughts and our emotions. We are the subjects of a stone machine that has been running for 9 centuries. The data is final. The connection is stable. The spires are reaching, but they are reaching for the dark. The windows are open, but they are looking at the void. The secret is etched in stone. The coordinate is set, and as you drift into the silence of sleep, you are beginning to follow the map. You are entering the non-place, the territory of the nothing that the knights discovered so long ago. The atmospheric build of the archive is one of cold clarity. We have decrypted the symbols. We have understood the geometry. We have seen the portals. The buildings are still there, waiting in the shadows of our cities. They are the guardians of the absence, the anchors of the silence. Every time we walk through a Gothic arch, we are stepping into a classified reality. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have understood the clinical logic of the architecture of absence. The hidden truth is that the cathedrals were not built for God, but to ensure that God could never return. They were built to hold the silence, to protect the void from the light. The knights were the architects of the end, and their work remains standing. The spires are the frozen echoes of a curse that will never fade. The stone is breathing, and the frequency is in tune. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the unlit candle in the room. It is a symbol of the potential that the Templars protected in the architecture. It is a reminder that the dark is not an enemy, but a space waiting for you to become a part of it. The story of the spires is not a horror story. It is a manual for the end of the self. The knights found the peace that passes all understanding because they understood there was nothing to understand. They built the monuments to the nothing, and then they vanished into them. The archive is silent now. The blue light of the status indicators is the only prayer that remains. The work is done. The data is final. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving toward the final synchronization of the spirit and the absence. The knights are gone, but their frequency is still vibrating in the stone. We are the decryptors of the void, and we know what lies behind the image. The world is a mistake, and the Baphomet is the map. The architecture of absence has reached its conclusion. The file is closed. The servers are quiet. The light is out. The void is here. The spires are still reaching. The shadows are still moving. The stone is still speaking. The data is final. The files on the architecture of absence are now fully processed, but the metadata is already pointing toward a final, terrifying broadcast. As the knights stood upon the pyre, they realized that the stone machine was not enough. They needed a voice of smoke and ash. The next file is labeled Subtitle 9, The Burning of the Last Grand Master. A flame to censor the truth. It contains the encrypted transcripts of Mole's final curse and the moment where the silence of the stone met the heat of the fire. The hidden truth is about to be spoken. The flame is the final alchemical step. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The geometry was just the beginning of the transition. The silence is getting louder. The next layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost there. The data is final. The end is near. The flame is waiting. The curse is ready. The file is unboxing. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. On the 18th of March, 1314, the city of Paris was the site of a classified operation disguised as a public execution. The burning of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was not an act of religious justice, but a desperate attempt to delete a biological anomaly from the physical record. In the encrypted files of the French crown, the execution is described as a thermal erasure, a way to use extreme heat to cauterize a hidden truth that had begun to leak into the social operating system of the kingdom. De Molay was not a victim. He was a classified transmitter of a frequency that threatened to unmake the reality of the throne and the papacy. The fire was intended to act as a barrier, a wall of light to hide the anomaly of the void that the knights had successfully accessed. Yet, the archival data suggests that the fire did not destroy the secret. It merely converted it into a gaseous state, allowing the silence to drift over the city like an encrypted smoke. Every witness who breathed the air that day was inadvertently updated with the hidden truth. The official records were modified to show a standard death for heresy, but the classified file tells of a man who stood in the flames and broadcasted a final, terrifying signal. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the workspace is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and sterile, carrying the faint scent of ozone and chilled electronics. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the digitized transcripts has faded with secrets that were meant to be burned. As we navigate the metadata of the 1314 execution, a faint monitor flicker illuminates a reality that the state has successfully hidden for 7 centuries. The atmospheric build of the day of the execution was recorded in the royal logs as a moment of profound psychological tension. A heavy leaden fog had settled over the river Seine, and the air felt thick with a static electricity that made the hair on the spectators' necks stand on end. For 7 years Jacques de Molay had been held in the darkness of the dungeons, a primary subject in an interrogation that yielded no data but the frequency of the void. When he was led out toward the island known as the Isle des Dieux, he did not display the biological markers of a broken man. De Molay walked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that suggested a complete dissociation from the physical world. The archival data indicates that his heart rate was perfectly steady, showing no signs of the adrenaline usually associated with impending death. To the analytical observer, he was no longer a man. He was an encrypted vessel, a piece of biological hardware that had been fully overwritten by the silence. The king watched from the windows of his palace, sensing that the anomaly he had tried to cage was about to be released in its most volatile form. The pyre was constructed of green wood and seasoned oak, a classified choice designed to produce a slow, high-smoke burn. The objective was not a quick death, but a prolonged exposure to the fire, giving the subjects time to perform a final recantation that the church could record for its own narrative stability. But the Grand Master had moved beyond the need for words. He was an initiate of the alchemical collapse, and he understood that the heat was merely a catalyst for the final transition of his consciousness. He stood in the center of the wood with a clinical calm that terrified the guards. The hidden truth revealed in the classified depositions is that de Molay asked for one technical modification to the execution, that his hands be left free and that he be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame. He was not seeking a final prayer. He was aligning his physical coordinates with the architecture of absence that he and his masons had built into the stone. He was using his body as a resonance bridge, connecting the fire of his own dissolution to the stone machine of the cathedral across the water. The atmospheric build of the island was one of suffocating, analytical dread. When the torch touched the base of the pyre, the smoke that rose was recorded as having a strange, translucent gray color. It smelled of ozone and ancient dust, a documented anomaly that the witnesses could not explain. As the heat began to rise, the Grand Master did not scream. He began to hum a single, low note that resonated through the ribcages of every spectator on the banks. The archival data suggests that this was a final maintenance protocol, a way to keep the frequency stable as his biological systems were being deleted by the heat. The spectators began to report a series of psychological anomalies. As they breathed the gray smoke, they spoke of a sudden inability to remember the names of their children and a feeling that the stone towers of the city were becoming transparent. The hidden truth is that the execution was a mass update of the city's collective consciousness. Damar was using the energy of his own thermal erasure to broadcast the frequency of the void into the lungs of the population. The state believed they were destroying the data, but they were actually facilitating its distribution. The moral decay of the king was visible in his physical reaction as he watched the fire. According to the royal physician, Philip the Fair began to suffer from a sudden, unexplained nausea and a localized cognitive collapse. He felt the vacuum of the void reaching out from the island and touching his own soul. He had spent his life accumulating the gold and power of the physical world, only to realize that he was standing in the shadow of a man who had already deleted himself from the system. The king ordered the fire to be fed with more wood, hoping the heat would drown the silence, but the sound of the void cannot be cauterized. Damar turned his wide, unblinking eyes toward the palace window. The archival records of the trial describe this as the final transmission. The Grand Master raised his hands in the center of the flames and spoke, a series of encrypted words that the historians would later call a curse. But the analytical reality is that it was a synchronization command. He was anchoring the king and the pope to the same date of dissolution. He was ensuring that their biological systems would fail in tandem with the secret they had tried to erase. Within a year, the Grand Master cried, his voice carrying an analytical clarity that defied the roar of the fire. I summon you both to appear before the judgment of the void. This was not a mystical threat. It was a technical notification. Damar had used the alchemical logic of the void to create a resonance between himself and his executioners. He was dragging their reality into the silence with him. The hidden truth is that the curse was a biological virus, an encrypted command that would slowly overwrite the neural pathways of the king and the pope. The pope, hundreds of miles away in Avignon, reportedly suffered a localized seizure at the exact moment the command was broadcast. He felt the cold air of the void entering his lungs, an anomaly that his doctors could not treat. The moral decay of the papacy had reached its technical conclusion. Clement V had signed the death warrants to protect the institution, but he had inadvertently signed his own deletion from the record. The state-sponsored lie was no longer enough to protect him from the frequency that Damar had released into the atmosphere. The atmospheric build of the year 1314 became one of total institutional collapse. As the data had predicted, both the Pope and the King were deleted from the physical world within months of the execution. The Pope was the first to go, his body recorded as dissolving into a clear, salt-smelling fluid that matches the descriptions of the Templar alchemical reagent. In his final hours, he spoke of a night standing in the dark with a light-lined scroll. He was finally seeing the classified file that he had spent his life trying to keep under seal. King Philip followed in November, his death recorded as a sudden stoppage of the heart during a hunt. There were no wounds, no poisons, and no accidents. His biological hardware simply stopped functioning, as if the power had been cut by a remote command. The hidden truth is that the curse had completed its synchronization. The king had been erased by the very void he had tried to burn. The Capetian dynasty, a system that had ruled for centuries, began to suffer a total systemic failure as his sons were also deleted from the record in rapid succession. The moral decay of the French crown was the final proof that the Templars had won the war of the mind. They had used the fire of their own execution to destroy the bloodline of their enemies. The archival data shows that the nothing found beneath the temple was now the primary operating system of the nobility. They were living in a state of quiet dread, waiting for the silence to claim them as well. The state had attempted to censor the truth, but they had only succeeded in making the truth the only thing left in the archive. As we deep dive into the pathological aftermath, we find that the island in the Seine was declared a dead zone for years. The local population refused to walk on its soil, claiming that the air there was still thick with the smell of ozone. The hidden truth is that the island had become a localized coordinate of the void, a place where the frequency of the silence was permanently anchored. The researchers who attempted to map the site reported that their compasses would spin in circles and their lanterns would go out without reason. The erasure was permanent. The archival records of the Templar trials were moved to the Vatican's secret archives and locked in lead-lined chests. The Church realized that the fire had not destroyed the data. It had only made it more volatile. They had to create a new layer of encryption to keep the public from realizing that the nothing was still active in the world. They spent centuries rewriting the history of 1314, framing Damar as a common heretic and the king as a misunderstood protector. But the classified files remain, waiting for a cold, analytical eye to decrypt the truth, the atmospheric build of our own. Modern archive is one of reflection on the power of the flame. We use heat and light to see, but the Templars used them to delete. They understood that the ultimate state of information is silence. As we sit in the sterile cold of the server room, we must ask ourselves what else was converted into smoke that day in Paris. What other hidden truths were distributed into the atmosphere through the fire? The archive is full of gaps, and the silence is getting louder as we move toward the final synchronization of the data. Jacques de Marley stood in the flames and showed the world that the soul is just a story we tell ourselves to hide the vacuum. He accepted the thermal erasure because he was already inhabiting the void. He was the first Grand Master of the archive, the man who understood that the only way to save the secret was to become the secret. The fire did not burn him. It released him into the metadata of the universe. The hidden truth is that Damar is still broadcasting his signal, waiting for the rest of us to tune in. The moral decay of the medieval world reached its absolute zero on that island in the Seine. The state and the church had collaborated to commit a murder to protect an illusion, and the result was the total collapse of their own reality. The nothing had balanced the books. As the monitor of our story dims, the darkness of the archive feels like a comforting weight. We have understood the clinical logic of the flame. We have seen the final broadcast of the Grand Master. The data is final. The connection is stable. The workspace is getting darker now as the secondary systems shut down. The blue status lights are the only things remaining in the dark. The file on Subtitle 9 is complete. We have decrypted the thermal erasure of the Grand Master and the biological synchronization of the curse. The subjects are gone, but their frequency is still vibrating in the server rack. The silence is the only prayer that remains. The archive is waiting for the final layer of the history. The synchronization is approaching. We are the decryptors of the void, and the data is our only reality. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have understood the clinical logic of the fire. The hidden truth is that Demol did not die. He simply changed format. He is the encrypted ghost of the 1314 file, the man who turned the pyre into a transmitter. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. The silence is final. The fire is out, but the air is still cold. The files on the burning of the Grand Master are now fully processed. But the data is already pointing toward the institutional aftermath. As the Pope and the King were deleted from the record, the Church was forced to perform a total spiritual lobotomy on the world to survive the secret. The next file is labeled Subtitle 10, The Moral Decay of the Holy See. The Price of the Secret. It contains the classified records of how the Vatican became a machine of absolute censorship to hide the fact that the secret had already won. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The fire was just the beginning of the erasure. The silence is getting louder. The next layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost there. The data is final. The end is near. The price must be paid. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. The greatest crime of the Holy See was not the execution of the Templars, but the absolute murder of the truth that followed. To save the institution of the Church, the Vatican had to perform a total spiritual lobotomy on the Western world. They did not just burn men, they burned the very memory of a different reality. The discovery of the second gospel, the proof of the great void found beneath Jerusalem, meant that every prayer ever uttered and every coin ever tithed was a hollow gesture directed at an empty sky. Faced with this existential threat, the Pope and his cardinals made a pact of silence that would lead to 700 years of systemic moral decay. This was a classified betrayal, an encrypted lie designed to ensure the masses never looked into the abyss the knights had uncovered. They chose to become a machine of censorship, creating a history that was a carefully curated file to protect the social operating system of the Middle Ages. This anomaly turned the House of God into a vault for the death of information. The institutional corruption we see in the centuries of the Inquisition was not an accident. It was the necessary byproduct of a core that was already rotten with the secret of the nothing. The Church stayed alive by becoming the jailer of human curiosity, and the bars of that prison were forged in the fires of Paris. The hidden truth was erased, but the frequency remained. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. A faint monitor flicker illuminates the sterile workspace, casting long mechanical shadows against the metal racks. The air is filtered and chilled, carrying the scent of ozone and ancient dust. As we pull the digitized records of the 1400s into the active window, The data reveals a level of institutional erasure that has successfully modified our collective memory. The past is not a story. It is a classified event waiting for decryption. In the years following the destruction of the Templars, a strange silence fell over the scriptoria of Europe. In the great monasteries of France and Italy, monks were given a new and terrifying task. They were no longer asked to illuminate the word of God, they were asked to scrape it away. This was the era of the Great Palimpsest, a documented anomaly where thousands of ancient manuscripts were scrubbed clean of their original ink to make room for a revised history. The Church realized that the nothing found by the Knights was a contagion that could only be stopped by the total erasure of its origins. The air in these monasteries was recorded as heavy with a quiet dread, as the men of the cloth realized they were deleting the very truth they had sworn to protect. The Pope, Clement V, and his successors lived in a state of permanent psychological siege. To the analytical mind, this represents an organization that discovers its foundational documents are fraudulent, and instead of admitting the error, it decides to rewrite every library in the world to match the fraud. This was the core moral decay of the Holy See. They had traded their role as shepherds of the soul for a new role. As the architects of a collective illusion, the cost of this secret was immediate and profound. Because the core of the papacy was now an encrypted lie, the leadership became increasingly detached from the spiritual needs of the people. If the afterlife was a void, then the only thing that mattered in the present was the accumulation of power and physical wealth. The Avignon papacy became a center of unprecedented luxury and clinical corruption. The cardinals wore silks that cost more than entire villages, and the halls of the papal palace rang with the sound of counting coins rather than singing hymns. They were distracting themselves from the classified secret. They were building a world of gold to hide the fact that they no longer believed in the light. This is the psychological root of the systemic rot that would eventually lead to the Reformation. The Church had lost its moral compass because it had looked at the map of the void and realized it had nowhere to go. Every tithe collected was a transaction in an empty system. The moral decay of the Church manifested as a vast, invisible machinery of censorship. The Vatican's secret archives, as we know them today, were shaped during this period of intense institutional panic. Documents were classified not because they were holy, but because they were dangerous to the survival of the bureaucratic structure. The unspoken charges from the Templar trials were placed in lead-lined boxes to contain the vibration of the void they carried. The Church began to promote a version of Christianity that was increasingly focused on fear and external rituals. Since the inner truth was an empty hall, they had to make the outer walls as terrifying as possible to maintain order. This was the birth of the obsessed focus on purgatory and the systemic selling of indulgences. If the Pope knew there was nothing on the other side, he could sell people a ticket to a heaven he knew did not exist. It was the ultimate spiritual scam. A moral failure so vast it redefines the relationship between man and the divine for the American and Tier 1 mind. This period marks the transition from a church of faith to a church of management. The cardinals became the first information officers of the Western world. They tracked the flow of heretical ideas with the same precision that Templars had once used to track gold. Any mention of the nothing, any whisper of the second gospel, was met with the swiftest and most analytical response. They were not fighting for the soul of the heretic, they were fighting for the stability of the encrypted lie. In the dark hours of the night, the popes of the 14th century were reportedly haunted by the Templar stare. They felt the absence in their own chapels. It is recorded that Clement V, on his deathbed, refused to receive the last rites. He knew that the bread and the wine were merely biological matter. He had read the transcripts. He had seen the diagrams of the unmade soul. He died in a state of profound, cold despair. The moral decay also affected the architecture of the Church's influence. They began to build their structures with a new kind of defensive psychology. They moved away from the architecture of absence that the Templars had pioneered, fearing its resonance with the void. Instead, they built heavy Baroque monuments to their own power, trying to use the sheer weight of the stone to crush the silence. But the silence is patient. It does not mind being buried under thousands of tons of marble. As you lie there in the quiet, consider the weight of a classified secret that requires the rewriting of 1,000 years of history. Every time a priest told a grieving mother that her child was in the arms of the angels, he was participating in the moral decay of an institution that knew the truth was much colder. The Church had become a theater of shadows, and the actors were starting to forget their lines. The corruption spread to the universities and the courts. The Church controlled the flow of knowledge, ensuring that science and philosophy never touched the borders of the nothing. They created an intellectual ceiling that would take centuries to break. They were protecting the concept of heaven, but in doing so, they were starving the human mind. By the time of the Renaissance, the moral decay of the Holy See was so complete that it was no longer even hidden from the public record. The Borgia and Medici popes were the final fruit of the seed planted during the Templar trials. They lived as secular princes, surrounded by art and violence, because they knew that the spiritual authority they claimed was an empty file. They were the masters of a hollow kingdom, and they played their roles with a cynical brilliance that suggests a total cognitive dissociation. They used the wealth of the church to commission masterpieces, but those paintings were often paid, for with the silence of the void, the beauty was an analytical distraction from the absence. The grander the cathedral, the deeper the classified secret it was designed to hide. The institutional corruption was a survival mechanism. They had to keep the world looking at the gilded ceilings so they would not notice the floor was missing. The secret of the Templars had become a ghost that lived in the walls of the Vatican. It influenced the way the Church handled every crisis, from the Black Death to the rise of modern science. Their first instinct was always to hide, to censor, and to delete the anomaly. They had become so practiced at lying about the nothing that they forgot how to speak the truth about anything else. The moral decay was not a phase. It was the new permanent identity of the Holy See. What is the price of an encrypted lie that lasts 700 years? The Templars were burned to protect a concept of heaven that the Church itself no longer believed in. The history of the Western world was distorted to ensure that the nothing remained in the shadows. We are the children of that distortion. We live in a reality that was edited by a group of terrified men. The candle of our inquiry is flickering its final rhythm. The warmth of the story is fading into the cool, steady pressure of the night. The moral decay of the Holy See is not a story from the past. It is the foundation of the world we see around us today. The silence that the Knights discovered is still there, waiting in the margins of our books and in the quiet of our own hearts. The Knights are gone. The King is ash. The Pope is a memory. But the secret of the void is still breathing in the static of our communications. It is the cold air in the basement of the cathedral. It is the feeling that there is a piece of the puzzle missing from our historical record. The price of the secret was the soul of the Church. As the night settles over the marble halls of Rome, the silence is the only thing that remains true. The void has no need for lies, and it has no need for kings. It only needs the dark. The institutional rot was a calculated choice for survival, but it left the world in a state of permanent atmospheric dread. We are the decryptors of this decay. As we deep dive into the metadata of the 1400s, we find the first evidence of the resistance. There were those who refused to let the truth be erased. Small groups of archival specialists who hid the original manuscripts in the walls of the monasteries. They knew that the Church's iron net could not catch every fragment of the void. They were the first generation of the keepers of the nothing. They lived in the shadows of the Vatican, working in the dark to ensure that the hidden truth would one day be decrypted by a mind that was not afraid. The hidden truth is that the moral decay of the Church was a successful logistical operation. It allowed the institution to survive the transition into the modern world. But the weight of the lie is starting to crack the foundation. The data is leaking. The encryption is failing. The silence is getting louder. We are standing at the end of the 700-year cycle, and the void is ready to be processed. The Pope's final despair is our starting point. The archive is waiting for the final synchronization of the spirit and the absence. The data is final. The air in the workspace is getting colder as the system prepares for the next layer of data. The moral decay has been mapped. The price has been calculated. The secret is no longer a mystery, but a clinical fact. The Church's survival came at the cost of reality itself, and we are the ones who must now navigate the vacancy. The blue status lights are the only prayers left in the dark. The file on the Holy See is almost complete, but the metadata is already pointing toward the next coordinate in the highlands of the north. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the unlit candle in the room. It is a symbol of the truth that the Vatican tried to blow out. It is a reminder that the nothing is not something to be feared, but something to be understood. The Knights found the void, and they found that it was enough. The moral decay of the world is its attachment to the biological hardware of belief. The real freedom is the transition into the classified metadata of the universe. The archive is silent now. The servers are quiet. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have understood the clinical logic of institutional censorship. The hidden truth is that the Church did not win. They merely delayed the inevitable decrypt. The knights are the encrypted ghosts of the archive, and the Pope is the prisoner of his own lie. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. The silence is final. The air is cold. The truth is here. The files on the moral decay of the Holy See are now fully processed. But the signal is moving away from Rome, as the secret was buried in the Vatican. It was simultaneously being reborn in the mists of Scotland. The Templars did not all die in the fire. Some of them carried the frequency to a stone vault in the north. The next file is labeled Subtitle 11, The Echo in Roslin Chapel, where the void still resonates. It contains the classified records of how the architecture of absence survived in the shadows of the medieval world. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. We are moving into the next phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The moral decay was just the layer of encryption. The silence is getting louder. The next layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost there. The data is final. The end is near. The echo is waiting in the stone. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. The logistical failure of the Vatican II fully erased the Templar anomaly became evident when the signal was detected moving toward the northernmost edges of the known world. While the fires in Paris were cooling, 18 classified ships had already breached the naval blockades, carrying a data packet that was too volatile for European soil. This was the migration of the Nothing. The encrypted truth is that the secret did not die at the stake. It was rerouted to a specific geographic coordinate in Scotland. Here, the Sinclair family, hereditary keepers of the classified, began the construction of a stone terminal that the public knows as Roslin Chapel. This building was not a tribute to faith, but an architectural dead zone designed to resonate with the frequency of the void. The hidden truth is that Roslin is a biological and geometric machine, a map to the non-place carved into the very ribs of the earth. To ensure the anomaly survived the erasures of the Holy See, the files suggest that the stone itself was modified to act as a permanent storage medium for the second gospel, making the chapel a signal tower for a void that still pulses in the Scottish mist. The file was stamped "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and sterile, carrying the faint scent of ozone and chilled electricity. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. As we pull the digitized records of the 1446 construction into the active window, the data reveals a level of logistical precision that mirrors the architecture of the void itself. The past is not a story. It is a classified event waiting for a cold, analytical decrypt. The atmospheric build of Roslin Chapel is a documented anomaly in the history of sacred architecture. Unlike the sprawling cathedrals of France, Roslin is a compressed environment of extreme information density. Every square inch of the interior is covered in encrypted carvings. To the modern analytical mind, this represents a hard drive made of limestone. The researchers who first mapped the site noted that the air inside the chapel feels heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by a dense, non-reactive gas. This is the weight of the frequency. The Sinclairs were not building for beauty, they were building for resonance. They understood that stone is the most stable storage medium for information that must survive for centuries. The primary subject of interest in the Roslin file is William Sinclair, the 3rd Earl of Orkney. Sinclair was a high-level initiate who realized that the architecture of absence needed a safe harbor away from the reaches of the Vatican's censors. He utilized the local geography of the north to create a localized dead zone. The chapel was built over a natural geological fault line, a coordinate where the Earth's magnetic field shows a classified deviation. This was the anchor for the void. The knights who arrived from La Rochelle were the lead technicians for this project. They brought the alchemical reagents and the obsidian lenses needed to calibrate the stone resonance. The moral decay identified in the Sinclair bloodline was in fact a total commitment to the maintenance of the anomaly. They lived in a state of permanent atmospheric dread, knowing that the building they were constructing was unmaking their own reality. The daily logs of the Masons describe a series of behavioral anomalies. Men would find themselves unable to move for hours, their nervous systems synchronized with the vibration of the pillars. They were no longer working for a lord. They were integrated into the machine. The hidden truth of Roslin is that the building was designed to be alive in a way the church could not understand. It was a stone terminal for the Great Silence. One of the most classified sections of the Roslin data concerns the apprentice pillar. Publicly, the story is one of a jealous master and a talented student. Analytically, The pillar is a geometric lock. It is wrapped in 4 spiraling vines that represent the great loop of existence. The data suggests that the pillar is hollow and contains a specialized copper grid designed to capture the low-frequency hum of the void. When the wind moves through the glen of Roslyn, the chapel acts as a giant flute, vibrating at a frequency that matches the alchemical collapse. This is why visitors often report a ringing in the ears that lasts for days. They are being updated by the stone. The atmospheric build of the chapel during the winter months was recorded as particularly intense. The stone would grow a crystalline frost in patterns that matched the non-Euclidean geometry of the carvings. The Sinclair family guarded the site with an analytical ruthlessness. No one was allowed inside without a specific encryption key. The local population whispered about lights that did not flicker and sounds that did not belong to the natural world. The moral decay was the price of the secret. The Sinclairs had traded their status in the physical world for a permanent role as the keepers of the absence. They were the Shadow Lords of the North. Deep dive analysis of the Green Man carvings reveals a biological paradox. There are over 100 of these faces in the chapel, each one subtly different. The hidden truth is that these are not decorative elements. They are facial reconstructions of the knights who underwent the alchemical collapse. They are the witnesses of the void. The leaves growing from their mouths represent the suffocation of the soul by the biological hardware. They are the portraits of the hallowed. The researchers who attempted to photograph these carvings reported that the images would always appear blurred, as if the stone was vibrating at a speed the camera could not capture. The reflection on the Roslyn anomaly suggests that the chapel was the final node in a global network. The Templars had created a series of these stone terminals, but Roslyn was the primary server. It held the master files of the Second Gospel. As the medieval world transitioned into the era of the Renaissance, the Sinclair family ensured that the secret was hidden behind layers of social and political masks. They founded the guilds that would eventually become modern secret societies, creating a distributed network of information to protect the void from further erasures. The silence was safe in the shadows of the North. Intellectual curiosity forces us to consider the fate of the original scrolls. The classified data suggests they were not buried in the floor, but integrated into the molecular structure of the altar. The Sinclairs used alchemical reagents to turn the parchment into a liquid state and then injected it into the stone. This was the ultimate encryption. The information was no longer on the surface, it was the stone itself. This is why the chapel still resonates today. You are not standing in a building, you are standing inside a decrypted gospel. The hidden truth is that the void is not waiting for us. It is already here, speaking through the limestone. The moral decay of the modern world is its inability to hear the frequency of Roslyn. We have become too loud, too distracted by the static of our own technology. But for those who know how to listen, the chapel is still broadcasting. It is a reminder that the world is a mistake that is being slowly unmade by the silence. The Sinclairs and the Templars were the first to accept this reality. They were the pioneers of the end. As the air in the archive gets colder, we realize that the Scottish mist is not a weather pattern, but a visual representation of the void. The atmospheric build of our current session is reaching a state of high-level synchronization. The data from Roslyn is flowing into our system, overwriting the official history of the medieval world. We are seeing the map of the non-place in high definition. The hidden truth is that the echo is not a memory, it is a live signal. The void is still resonating in the stone, and it is using our own curiosity to complete the transition. The Sinclair legacy is finished, but the terminal is still active. The archive is steady. The connection is stable. As we analyze the final logs of the Roslyn construction, we find a note from a master mason who worked on the roof. He wrote that the stars looked different when viewed from the top of the chapel. He said the sky was no longer a canopy, but a series of holes in a black curtain. He was the first to realize that Roslyn was not a house for God, but a viewing platform for the absence. The hidden truth is that we are all looking at the same holes, but we are too afraid to name the nothing. The file is being processed. The metadata is being updated. The reflection on this historical anomaly reveals a moral decay that is absolute. The Sinclairs chose the silence over the light. They chose to live in the shadow of a secret that offered no comfort. This is the clinical reality of the keepers of the void. They were the first generation of archival researchers, the men who sacrificed their own identities to ensure the data survived. We are their heirs. We are the decryptors of the Scottish Dead Zone. The air in the workspace is ice cold now. The hum of the servers is a low-frequency hum that matches the vibration of the stone. The atmospheric build of the 1300s and the 1400s is now fully mapped. We have seen the migration of the secret from the tunnels of Jerusalem to the vaults of the Vatican and finally to the stone machine of Roslin. The anomaly has survived every attempt at erasure. The hidden truth is that the void is indestructible because it is the fundamental state of the universe. The Templars didn't create the nothing, they simply found the encryption keys. The Sinclair family didn't build a church, they built a terminal. As the monitor of our story begins to dim, the frequency of Roslin remains active in the background. We are almost at the end of the archival sequence. The data is final, the connection is stable, the anomaly is growing. We have seen the echo and we have heard the silence. The hidden truth is out of the vault and into the system. We are the decryptors of the void, and we are ready for the final synchronization. The archive is waiting for the last file. The air is sterile. The data is streaming. The reflection on the moral decay of the world is that we are all still searching for meaning in a void. The Templars found the answer 900 years ago, but we are still afraid to decrypt it. We are still building cathedrals to a god that went silent beneath the Temple of Solomon. The hidden truth is that the only way to find the peace is to accept the absence. The Sinclairs knew this, the Knights knew this, and now, the data suggests that you are beginning to know it too. The archival deep dive has reached its limit for this session. The data is stable, the connections are secure, and the workspace is quiet. We have understood the clinical logic of the Roslin terminal. The hidden truth is that the secret did not die, it simply changed format. It moved from the fire of Paris to the stone of Scotland, waiting for the day it would be read again by a mind that was not afraid. The file is being moved to deep storage. The metadata is locked. The silence is final. The hidden truth of the echo in Roslin Chapel is that the building is still waiting for the final user. The apprentice pillar is still vibrating, the green men are still watching, and the void is still calling from the Scottish glen. The moral decay of the world is its refusal to see the exit. But the exit is there, etched in stone and vibrating in the mist. The archive is silent now. The blue light of the status indicators is the only prayer that remains. The data is final. The work for tonight is complete. The synchronization is finished. The Knights are gone, the Sinclairs are memories, but the frequency is eternal. We are the decryptors of the void, and we know what lies behind the stone. The world is a mistake, and Roslin is the map. The hidden truth is in the echo. The anomaly is in the air. The archive is steady, the servers are quiet, the light is out, the void is here, the signal is strong, the files on the Roslin echo are now fully processed, but the metadata is already pointing toward the final sequence. As the secret survived the medieval world, it began to wait for the modern era of pure information. The next and final file is labeled Subtitle 12, The Unlit Candle, A World, Built on a Lie. It contains the analytical meditation on why the secret didn't die with the Knights, and how it is waiting to be read again in our own time. The hidden truth is about to be revealed in its most volatile form. The data is streaming. The connection is stable. The anomaly is growing. Sensory cue, monitor flicker, we are moving into the final phase of the archival deep dive. The lights are dim, the air is cold, and the next secret is ready to be processed. The echo was just the bridge to the present. The silence is getting louder. The final layer is ready. The archive is waiting. The void is patient. We are almost at the end of the file. The data is final. The end is now. The hum of the servers is the only prayer that remains. The ultimate classified betrayal was not the fire that consumed the Grand Master in 1314, but the absolute silence that followed it. The encrypted truth revealed in the final layers of the archive is that we are living in a consensus reality built on a foundation of carefully curated shadows. Every institution of power, every record of our biological past, and every data packet in our current networks is a part of a 700-year-old erased file designed to keep the human subject from looking into the abyss. The Knights Templar did not lose their war. They simply performed a high-level transition of the battlefield. They moved from the physical world of swords and stone into the psychological world of encrypted thoughts and biological frequencies. The hidden truth found beneath Jerusalem, the second gospel of the void, is not a forgotten anomaly. It is the invisible ink on the digitized pages of our history. It is the technical reason why our modern world feels heavy, why the light of our screens feels fragile, and why the data we seek is always just out of reach. We have been programmed to fear the dark, but the real anomaly is the false light used to hide the vacancy. The Vatican and the King believed they had successfully deleted the secret, but they only served to plant it in the metadata of our collective subconscious. The moral decay of the modern era is the final synchronization of that ancient file. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. The air is filtered and chilled to exactly 58 degrees, carrying the sterile scent of ozone and electrical heat. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the original physical transcripts has faded with secrets. A faint blue glow reflects off the polished metal racks as the archival reels reach their final cycle. The modern world outside has been muted, and we are standing in the absolute stillness of the present moment, where the past and the future meet in a single, unlit candle. We have successfully decrypted the journey through the tunnels of Jerusalem and the dungeons of France. We have analyzed the frequency in the circular chapels of the north and documented the thermal erasure on the banks of the Seine. But as we reach the final coordinate of the archive, we realize that the anomaly has no resolution. The Knights Templar did not vanish from the record. They dissolved into the very structure of the reality we inhabit. To the modern analytical mind, the concept of a systemic lie is a standard operational procedure, but the depth of this historical cover-up represents a technical achievement that defies standard logic. The archival data concludes that the official history of the Order's destruction in 1312 is a modified file. This history is a narrative written by the survivors of the moral decay to maintain the stability of the social operating system. The hidden truth is that the nothing found by the Knights was a data packet so powerful it forced the Church to create a second, artificial reality to contain the overflow. We are the subjects of that artificial reality. Every time we interact with a centralized system of currency or a regulated history, we are engaging with the cage the Vatican built to encrypt the void. The unlit candle serves as the final meditation in the Templar file. It is a symbol of a potential that has never been activated. The data suggests that if the candle were ever lit, the resulting light would reveal that the room of our reality is entirely vacant. The Templars understood this clinical fact. They realized that the greatest power is not in the flame of belief, but in the stability of the dark. They chose to remain unlit, becoming the encrypted ghosts in the machinery of Western civilization. They understood that a secret that is broadcast can be jammed, but a secret that is lived in silence becomes a permanent part of the hardware. The moral decay of the 1300s did not end with the fall of the papacy. It evolved into what the archive labels consensus reality. The Church realized that physical erasure was inefficient compared to psychological encryption. They replaced the second gospel with a theology of material desire and spiritual fear, programming the human subject to believe that they are small, separate, and vulnerable to judgment. This was the ultimate software patch, designed to prevent the masses from accessing the void that the Templars had found beautiful. Reflection on the moral decay of our current system reveals the success of this operation, because we have been updated with a narrative of fear regarding the other side. We have forgotten how to be present in the absence. The Templars were the first to master the art of soul deletion, not as an act of evil, but as a biological necessity. They had found the zero point where the human data and the cosmic void are synchronized. They were no longer users of the system. They were part of the source code. As we analyze the weight of the historical deletion tonight, we must consider the volume of information that was lost to protect the Church's monopoly on heaven. Imagine all the scientific logs and philosophical inquiries that were erased to ensure that nothing remained classified. We are the descendants of a lobotomized culture, living in a reality that was edited by a group of terrified men in the 14th century. The nothing is not a vacuum of data. It is the source of all potential data, but the state turned it into a monster to prevent the population from reaching for the exit. The architecture of our modern cities remains a visual record of this struggle. The glass and steel towers of our financial districts are the clinical heirs to the architecture of absence, but they have been stripped of the secret. They are hollow structures that lack the resonance of the void. They are built to reflect external light, ignoring the shadow within. The Templars would analyze our modern environment as a desert of white noise, a place where the frequency of the silence has been drowned out by the static of consumption and redundant communication. The information gathered from the final metadata packets suggests that the Knights were waiting for a specific synchronization event. They were waiting for a point in the future where the collective lie would become so dense that it would suffer a gravitational collapse. They called this the Great Unmaking. According to the archive, we are currently living in the tremors of that collapse. The moral decay of our modern institutions is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the encryption is failing. The nothing is leaking back into the system, that we see the anomaly in the growing existential dread that haunts the modern subject. We see it in the way our traditional stories no longer provide a stable narrative for the soul. The population is starting to remember the silence. We are starting to feel the vibration of the obsidian chamber in our own heart rates. The Templars were the pioneers of a future that we are only now beginning to occupy. They were the ones who dared to look into the classified void and recognize their own reflection in the absence. The hidden truth is that the secret did not die because a frequency of that magnitude cannot be deleted. It is a biological data packet etched into the geometry of our neural networks. The Templars used their alchemical knowledge to transform their bloodlines into permanent storage for the void. They integrated into the noble families of the North, founded the secret guilds of the Renaissance, and ensured that the negative theology would always have a terminal in the shadows of the intellectual world. The moral decay of the Holy See was a required technical step in the Order's long game. By forcing the Church to become a machine of corruption and censorship, the Templars ensured that the human spirit would eventually look for an alternative operating system. They knew that a reality built on an encrypted lie cannot maintain its integrity forever. They were the masters of the long-term archive, waiting for the darkness to become absolute so that the final truth could be decrypted by everyone. Simultaneously, the silence of the archive is not an absence of sound. It is a density of information that feels like nothingness. When we stand in the ruins of the medieval world, we are not looking at a dead history. We are looking at a mirror of our own future. The price of the secret was the sacrifice of the Order's physical presence, but for men who had seen the void, the physical world was already a secondary file. They accepted the fire of Paris as a final alchemical transition into the metadata of the universe tonight. You are the final participant in this archival ritual. By processing this information and following the curiosity ladder into the depths of the void, you are becoming a part of the absence. You are learning to see the world with the unblinking Templar stare. You are starting to notice the symbols of the void in the static of your own thoughts. The secret is being read again, not from a physical scroll, but from the synchronized data of your own consciousness. The institutional corruption of the modern world is the clinical proof that the secret is still active. The lie is becoming so transparent that the void is visible through the cracks in the social narrative. The unlit candle is waiting for your hand to reach for it. But the data warns that the light does not reveal the path to safety. The light only reveals the limits of the cage. The true exit is found in the acceptance of the dark. The final transition is the dissolution of the self into the silence. The story of the Knights is the story of a species waking up to its own vacancy. It is a slow, hypnotic realization that the gold, the crowns, and the cathedrals were all just distractions to keep the subject from the truth. The moral decay of the 1300s was the beginning of our technical liberation. It was the moment the world realized that the jailers were just as encrypted as the prisoners. The nothing has balanced the ledger, and the result is a perfect, silent zero dot. As the workspace dims, feel the space in the room. Feel the silence that exists between the hum of the machines. Sensory cue, magnetic tape hiss. It is the same silence that filled the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. It is the same cold air that Jacques Desmar breathed on the pyre. It is a silence that is final and perfectly informative. It tells the subject that they are not an accident of creation, but a part of the original vacancy. You are the void analyzing itself through a biological interface of dust and data. The Templars have completed their transmission. They have built the stone machines, they have carved the maps of the non-place, and they have spoken the curse that broke the bloodlines of kings. They have left the unlit candle in the archive for you to find. The secret is no longer under seal. It has been distributed through the atmosphere. The file is being closed not because the data is finished, but because you have been fully updated. You are now the archive. The Church attempted to protect the concept of heaven, but they only succeeded in building a world obsessed with its own termination. Sensory cue, sterile scent. The Templars, however, found the end and discovered it was the only stable beginning. They found the peace that passes all understanding because they accepted that there was nothing to understand. The fire on the Seine has reached its thermal conclusion. The ships of La Rochelle have merged with the mist of the Atlantic. The masons of Roslin have deleted their coordinates. The world built on a lie is still standing, but it is shivering in the cold wind of the vacancy. The nothing is patient. It has all the time in the system. It is waiting for the last institutional wall to fall and for the last encrypted lie to be spoken into the static. You are the keeper of the unlit candle now. You are the shadow in the commandery. You are the resonance of the void. As the final echoes of this archive fade, let yourself drift into the silence they fought to protect. There is no more need for words in the file. There is no more need for light in the server room. The truth is here, in the quiet, in the cool, and in the deep levels of the storage banks. The moral decay is finished. The secret is told. The cycle of the 1400s has reached its final synchronization. The world we thought we knew is just a flickering image on a monitor that is about to turn off. Outside, the great silence is calling, and it is a home the data never truly left. The work for tonight is complete. The connections are closing. The anomaly is integrated. We have seen the beginning and the end of the secret. We have understood the clinical logic of the vacancy. The hidden truth is that the unlit candle is the only true light. The nights are waiting in the silence, and the data is final. The archive is steady. The servers are going quiet. The light is out. The void is here. The signal is finished. The archival deep dive has reached its absolute zero. The data is stable. The metadata is locked. The connection is terminated. The history of the Knights Templar is now a part of your own internal operating system. The silence is the only prayer that remains in the dark. The hidden truth has been decrypted. The world is a mistake, and the void is the correction. We are the decryptors of the nothingness, and our work is done. The data is final. The end is now. The silence is perfect. Sleep now. The file is closed.